Before we begin, I want to take a quiet moment to thank you for being here tonight. Whether you found this video by accident, whether someone recommended it to you, or whether you've been here before and you came back, it means everything. These videos take a long time to research and write, and every single hour is poured into making sure that what you hear tonight is worth your time. If you enjoy this kind of storytelling, this slow, careful kind of history that unravels like a dream, please consider subscribing. It costs nothing, and it helps more than you know, and I am genuinely curious about you tonight. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Now, close your eyes if you'd like. Let your body settle into wherever you're resting tonight. The day is done. Whatever it held, whatever it asked of you, it's over now. You are here. You are safe. And tonight, we are going somewhere very, very far away. We are going to the beginning, not the beginning of your country, not the beginning of your language or your culture or your religion. We are going to something older than all of those things combined. We are going back nearly 6,000 years to a flat, sun-baked land wedged between two great rivers, where a group of people we now call the Sumerians built something that had never existed before on the face of the earth. They built civilization, not a tribe, not a village, not a wandering band following herds across open grass. They built cities, real cities, with streets and laws and temples and written language and kings and armies and trade and schools. They built the world's first bureaucracy, which sounds terribly dull, but was in fact one of the most radical ideas any human mind had ever produced. They invented writing, they invented the wheel, they invented mathematics and astronomy and legal codes and poetry and beer and irrigation canals that could carry water for 50 miles across desert sand, and then, slowly, over centuries, they were absorbed into other empires, their language forgotten, their cities buried beneath the dust of time, their names lost so completely that even the ancient Greeks, who knew so much about the ancient world, had never heard of them. The Sumerians vanished so thoroughly that we didn't know they had ever existed until the mid-19th century, when archaeologists began digging into strange, flat-topped mounds rising from the plains of what is now southern Iraq and found, buried beneath 30 feet of dirt and sand, the ruins of cities that were already ancient when Egypt was young. Tonight, we are going to walk through that world. We are going to stand in the marshes where it all began. We are going to watch the first cities rise from the mud. We are going to meet the kings and the priests and the merchants and the farmers and the scribes who kept records on small tablets of wet clay. We are going to feel the weight of history as the great city of Ur reaches its peak and glitters under a Mesopotamian sky. And we are going to sit quietly at the end as the rivers shift and the rains fail and the world that the Sumerians built crumbles into silence. This is a story about the first people who ever looked at the chaos of the natural world and said, "We can do better than this." And for a while, they were right. Let's begin at the very beginning. Not with the Sumerians themselves, but with the land that made them possible. Imagine a vast, flat plain, the flattest land you have ever seen. Not the gentle rolling flatness of the American Midwest, but something almost supernatural in its evenness. A plain so flat that you can stand in the middle of it and see perfectly in every direction for 20 miles. And the horizon is a clean, unbroken line. This is ancient Mesopotamia. The word itself comes from the Greek words for between the rivers, and that is exactly what it is. The land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, two great rivers that descend from the mountains of modern Turkey and flow southward through what is now Iraq, spreading wider and slower as they approach the sea, depositing enormous quantities of silt as they go. That silt is the key to everything. For thousands of years before any human settlement, those two rivers flooded every spring, retreating every autumn, and with each cycle, they left behind a thin layer of incredibly rich, dark soil. Over millennia, those layers accumulated, building up a floodplain of extraordinary fertility. The soil of southern Mesopotamia could grow more food per acre than almost anywhere else on Earth. But there was a problem. Two problems, actually. The first was that there was almost no rain. Southern Mesopotamia is semi-arid, and in the deep south, near the Persian Gulf, it is almost desert. The plants that could feed a civilization would not grow here without water being deliberately brought to them. The second problem was that when the rain did come, usually in late winter or early spring, it came all at once, and the rivers rose so fast and so violently that they could destroy crops and villages in a matter of hours. Flood, then drought. Too much water, then none at all. This sounds like a terrible place to build a civilization. And yet, the people who first settled this land looked at those two problems and saw something different. They saw that if you could control the water, if you could catch it when there was too much and direct it to the fields when there was too little, you would have access to the richest farmland in the world. So they built canals, they dug ditches, they constructed levees. They diverted water from the rivers into networks of channels that spread across the plain like fingers, reaching the fields that would otherwise be dust. They built catchment ponds to store water during the floods, and they opened those ponds during the dry months. This was not easy work. It required coordination. It required many people working together, following a plan, following instructions, following a leader. And that need for coordination, more than anything else, may be what made civilization possible. When you have to work together to survive, you develop systems, rules, division of labor. Someone has to decide where the canals go. Someone has to organize the workers. Someone has to keep track of who is growing what and where, and how much food is going into the storage house and how much is coming out. Someone has to keep records. And so before there were kings, before there were temples, before there were armies or scribes or laws, there were farmers trying to keep track of grain. And that basic practical need, the need to count and to remember, planted the seed for everything that followed. The first settlements in southern Mesopotamia appear in the archaeological record around 5,500 BCE. That is 7,500 years ago. These were not yet cities. They were villages, small collections of mud brick houses clustered near the rivers, their inhabitants growing wheat and barley, herding sheep and goats, fishing in the marshes at the edge of the Persian Gulf. The marshes deserve a moment of attention because they were extraordinary. At the southern end of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates approach the sea, they spread out into a vast network of shallow lakes and reed beds and winding channels of dark water. This is the region known today as the Ahwa, or the Mesopotamian marshes, and it still exists, though greatly diminished. In ancient times it was immense. Hundreds of miles of water and reeds and birds. The people who lived there in those earliest times built floating islands from the dense reeds that grew 10 and 12 feet tall along the banks. They wove the reeds into houses, into boats, into baskets. They fished and hunted the birds that nested in the marsh grasses, and they traded with the farming communities that were beginning to take shape on the drier land to the north. These marsh people are often overlooked in the history of Mesopotamia, which tends to focus on the great cities that came later. But they were there at the beginning, and the reed architecture they developed, the graceful curved arches of bundled reeds, appears in the art and architecture of Sumerian civilization for thousands of years afterward, long after people had stopped building in reeds and had switched to mud brick. Some echoes last. Around 4,500 BCE, something remarkable begins to happen. The settlements in southern Mesopotamia begin to grow. Not just a little. They grow dramatically, almost explosively, in a way that archaeologists have found difficult to fully explain. Within a few centuries, what had been small villages begin to look like something else entirely. This period is called the Ubaid period, named after Tel al-Ubaid, a small mound near the ancient city of Ur, where the distinctive pottery of this era was first identified. The Ubaid people were not yet the Sumerians. The question of exactly who the Sumerians were and where they came from is one of the genuinely mysterious questions in the history of the ancient world, and we will come back to it. But the Ubaid period sets the stage. During this era, the settlements of southern Mesopotamia begin developing a pattern that will define Sumerian civilization for thousands of years. At the center of each settlement, a large building begins to appear, larger than any house, larger than any storehouse. Built on a raised platform, facing a particular direction, decorated in ways that set it apart from ordinary buildings. A temple, not perhaps a temple as we might imagine one today, not a soaring cathedral or a carved marble edifice. These early temples were made of mud brick, which is to say dried clay, and they were relatively simple in form, but they were clearly places of special importance. Places where something happened that didn't happen in ordinary houses. The presence of these temples tells us something important. By 4500 BCE, the people of southern Mesopotamia already had a complex religious life. They already believed in gods, or at least in powers beyond the human, and they already felt the need to build physical spaces dedicated to communicating with those powers. Religion, in other words, was there at the very beginning of civilization, and for the Sumerians, it never stopped being central to everything. Let's talk about the land a little more, because the physical reality of where the Sumerians lived shaped their psychology in ways that I think are important to understand if you want to really feel what their world was like. Southern Mesopotamia, ancient Sumer, is not a beautiful landscape in the way that we typically romanticize ancient settings. It is not Greece, with its white cliffs above a blue sea. It is not Egypt, with its golden desert and the green ribbon of the Nile. It is flat. It is brown. The horizon is enormous, and the sky is enormous, and you are very, very small beneath both of them. The sun is brutal. In summer, temperatures in the region regularly reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and there is almost no shade. The wind that comes from the northwest, called the shamal, blows constantly, carrying fine dust that gets into your eyes and your mouth and your food. In winter, the same wind carries cold down from the mountains, and the plains can feel bleak and exposed. The rivers, which give life, can also take it. A flood that rises a few feet too high can drown an entire season's harvest. A season with too little rain in the mountains upstream means the rivers run low, the canals don't fill, and crops wither. Living in this landscape, dependent on forces you cannot control, you might develop a particular relationship with the divine. Not a relationship of warmth and reassurance, but something more complicated, something closer to negotiation, or even anxiety. And indeed, the religion of the Sumerians was notably anxious in character. Their gods were not particularly benevolent. They were powerful, capricious, difficult to please, and capable of destroying what they had built simply because it suited them. The great Sumerian myths are full of floods and destructions and divine anger. The world, in Sumerian theology, was a dangerous place, and human beings were in it to serve the gods and to hope, through correct behavior and proper offerings, to avoid the worst of divine wrath. This is a very different religious sensibility from, say, the warmth of certain Buddhist traditions, or the personal relationship with a loving God that characterizes much of Christianity. The Sumerians did not feel that the universe was inherently on their side, and yet they built. They kept building, kept organizing, kept writing down their records and their prayers and their stories. There is something deeply admirable in that, in people who looked at a frightening universe and decided to try anyway. The period that archaeologists call the Uruk period begins around 4000 BCE and lasts until roughly 3100 BCE. It is named after the city of Uruk, which during this era becomes something entirely new in the history of the world. A city, not a large village, not a town. A city, in the full modern sense of the word, with tens of thousands of inhabitants, with specialized labor, with monumental architecture, with administration and record-keeping and trade networks that extended hundreds of miles in every direction. Uruk is important enough that we need to spend some time there, because what happened in Uruk during this period is, without exaggeration, one of the most significant developments in the entire history of our species. But before we get to what Uruk became, let's think about what it must have looked like as it was growing. In those early centuries, Uruk was probably a collection of neighborhoods clustered around two major temple complexes. The Eanna precinct was dedicated to Inanna, the goddess of love and war, who would become one of the most important figures in all of Sumerian religion. The Anu district was dedicated to Anu, the sky god, the father of all the gods in the Sumerian pantheon. Both of these precincts included buildings of remarkable sophistication for their time. The White Temple, which sat atop a large mud brick platform platform called a ziggurat was plastered white and gleamed in the harsh Mesopotamian sunlight. It could be seen from miles away across the flat plain. Think about what that meant for the people who lived in the surrounding villages and farmsteads. For them, that gleaming white building on its high platform would have been the dominant feature of the landscape, visible on the horizon from the moment they woke up in the morning to the moment the sun set and it disappeared into darkness. It was always there. It was the largest structure any of them had ever seen. It was the home of the goddess, and the city that surrounded it was growing. By 3400 BCE, Uruk had somewhere between 25,000 and 50,000 inhabitants. To put that in context, at the same time, most of the rest of the world was still organized in villages of a few hundred people at most. There was nothing else like Uruk anywhere on the face of the earth. The growth of Uruk created pressures and problems that had never existed before. How do you feed 50,000 people? How do you organize the labor of that many individuals? How do you distribute resources fairly, or at all? How do you keep track of what belongs to whom? What has been produced? What has been consumed? What is owed? The Sumerians of Uruk invented answers to these questions, and some of those answers were so fundamental that we still use versions of them today. The most important invention of this period, and perhaps of all of ancient history, is writing. Not the writing we are using right now, with its elegant alphabet of 26 letters. The Sumerians had no alphabet. What they invented was something different, and in some ways more extraordinary. A system of symbols pressed into wet clay that could represent specific objects, quantities, and eventually ideas and sounds. It began with counting. The temple complexes of Uruk were not just religious centers, they were also economic centers. The temple employed huge numbers of workers, craftsmen, farmers, herders, boat builders, weavers, brewers. The temple received enormous quantities of goods as offerings and as taxes, and it distributed those goods back out again as payment and as charity. Someone had to keep track of all of this. At first, the Sumerians used small clay tokens. A sphere might represent a unit of grain, a cone might represent a smaller unit. These tokens were stored in clay envelopes, sealed with a stamp, but this system had limitations. To know what was inside an envelope, you had to break it open. So some unknown genius whose name we will never know, had an idea. Instead of putting tokens inside an envelope, why not press the tokens against the outside of the clay before it dried? The impression would remain after the clay hardened, showing exactly what was inside without breaking the seal. And then came the next step, the one that changed everything. Why bother with the tokens at all? Why not just press a stylus into a flat clay tablet and make marks that represented the tokens directly? And so, around 3400 BCE, in the city of Uruk, in what is now southern Iraq, the first written records in human history appear. They are not poetry, they are not prayers, they are not stories, they are receipts, lists of grain, counts of sheep, records of fish delivered to the temple storehouse, practical, mundane, utterly necessary records of economic transactions. Writing was invented to count things, but once you have a system for making marks that represent things, you can extend it. You can use it to represent actions as well as objects. You can use it to represent sounds as well as meanings. You can use it to record not just what happened today, but what happened 10 years ago. You can use it to send a message to someone who isn't in the same room. You can use it to write a law that everyone must follow, even people who weren't there when the law was made. Writing makes time travel possible. Not literally, of course, but a clay tablet with writing on it carries the thoughts of a person who died 5,000 years ago directly into your mind as you read it. That is a kind of time travel that the Sumerians invented, and we have been using it ever since. The script that the Sumerians developed is called Cuneiform, from the Latin word for wedge-shaped, because the marks are made by pressing a wedge-shaped stylus into soft clay at different angles to create combinations of wedge impressions. It is not a beautiful script to modern eyes. It looks like the tracks left by small birds walking across wet sand, but it worked, and it spread, and it lasted for 3,000 years, adopted by one civilization after another across the ancient Near East. More than 500,000 cuneiform tablets have been excavated from the sites of ancient Mesopotamian cities. A substantial number of them have still not been translated. There are more texts from ancient Mesopotamia than from ancient Egypt and ancient Greece combined. The Sumerians and their successors were prolific writers, and the clay that preserved their words is far more durable than the papyrus that carried the words of the Greeks and Romans. Because of cuneiform, we know an extraordinary amount about daily life in ancient Sumer. We know what people ate and what they paid for it. We know what disputes they brought to the courts and how those disputes were resolved. We know the names of merchants and scribes and administrators, people who lived and breathed and worried about their debts 5,000 years ago, whose names are preserved because they pressed them into clay. We know their stories, their myths, their prayers. We know a love poem written by a Sumerian woman to her king that is among the most tender pieces of writing from the ancient world. We know a text called the Instructions of Uruk, which is a father's advice to his son and which contains wisdom that sounds remarkably applicable today. Don't buy a donkey that brays too much. Don't stand surety for someone else. Don't talk back to your elders. Be careful about the kind of people you spend time with. 5,000 years ago, a father wrote those things down for his son, and we can read them. The Uruk period ends around 3100 BCE, with a cultural and economic pullback that archaeologists can trace in the archaeological record, but don't fully understand. The Uruk colonies, trading outposts that had spread remarkable distances across the ancient Near East, disappear. Trade contracts. And then, a few centuries later, we enter the period that is in some ways the heart of Sumerian history. The early dynastic period, beginning around 2900 BCE. This is the era of the city-states. Imagine the landscape of southern Mesopotamia at this time. The flat plain is dotted with cities, each surrounded by its own ring of cultivated fields and connected to the rivers by a network of canals. Each city is dominated by its temple precinct, rising on a high platform above the flat city around it. Each city has its own patron god, its own king, its own army. Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, Eridu, Kish, Shuruppak. These names may not mean much to you tonight, but in their time, they were the centers of everything. They were where the records were kept and the laws were made. They were where the greatest poets lived and the most skilled craftsmen worked. They were where the kings held court and the priests performed their rituals at the feet of towering statues of the gods. And they were almost constantly at war with each other. The city-states of Sumer fought over water. Specifically, they fought over control of the canals that connected the rivers to the fields. In a land where rainfall was unreliable, whoever controlled the water controlled life itself. A city that could divert the canal away from its neighbor's fields could starve that neighbor into submission without ever raising a weapon. They also fought over land. The boundaries between one city's territory and the next were constantly disputed, constantly shifting with the fortunes of war. The most famous of these conflicts, because we have detailed records of it from both sides, is the long war between the cities of Lagash and Umma. These two cities shared a border and disputed its location for generations. There are inscriptions from Lagash describing how Umma violated a boundary agreement and flooded Lagash's fields. There are counter-inscriptions describing it differently. Reading these ancient texts, with their accusations and counter-accusations, their appeals to the gods to witness the justice of their cause, their descriptions of battles and truces and violated agreements, you cannot help but feel that human nature has changed very little in 5,000 years. But out of this constant conflict came something important: the development of more sophisticated forms of military organization, and eventually, more sophisticated forms of political organization. The kings of Sumer became more powerful as the need for military leadership grew. The role of the king was increasingly separated from the role of the priest, who had previously held most of the authority in these temple-centered communities. A new kind of power was emerging, not sacred power, but secular power. The power of the sword, the power of the army, the power of a man who could organize other men for war and lead them to victory. The kings of the early dynastic period are a fascinating group. We know many of their names from the Sumerian king list, an extraordinary document that lists all the kings of Sumer from the beginning of time, giving the length of each king's reign. In the earliest entries, the lengths of reign are fantastical. Before the Great Flood, we are told, one king ruled for 43,200 years. Another ruled for 36,000 years. The numbers are clearly not historical. They belong to myth rather than record. But as the list continues, the numbers become shorter, and the names begin to match names we find in other documents, on inscriptions from actual ruins of actual cities. The mythical gives way, gradually, to the historical. And somewhere in that transition, legend and reality blur together in a way that is deeply human, because that is what people do with their past. They make it larger than it was. They make it more than it was. They remember their ancestors as giants. The most famous figure from this era, the one whose name has survived most vividly, is not a historical king at all, but a legendary one. Or rather, a figure who may have started as a historical king and was then transformed over centuries of storytelling into something far greater than any real person could be. His name is Gilgamesh, and his story is the oldest written story in the history of the world. The Epic of Gilgamesh. I want to say that slowly, because it deserves the weight of the words. The oldest written story in human history. Older than Homer, older than the Bible, older than almost anything else we have. It was written down on clay tablets, the earliest versions around 2100 BCE, though the stories themselves are probably much older. It was discovered in the 19th century in the ruins of the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, where copies had been made of much older Sumerian texts. And when a young scholar named George Smith first translated the flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh and realized that it described a great flood with a man chosen by the gods to build a boat and save his family and the animals of the earth, he was so overwhelmed that he ran out of the building and began taking off his clothes in the street. I find that detail delightful. History, at its most human, but the Epic of Gilgamesh is more than a curiosity. It is a profound piece of literature that deals with questions that are still central to human experience. What does it mean to be a great ruler? What is the nature of friendship? What is the purpose of war and glory if everyone, even the greatest hero, must eventually die? How do we live with the knowledge of our own mortality? Gilgamesh, as the epic tells it, was 2/3 god and 1/3 mortal, the king of Uruk, a man of extraordinary beauty and strength. He was so powerful and so energetic that the people of Uruk were exhausted by him. He challenged every young man to combat, and he took the attention of every young woman. His subjects were worn out, so the gods, in their wisdom, decided that Gilgamesh needed a companion, someone equal to him in strength and spirit, someone who could absorb his energy and give him something to focus on. They created Enkidu. Enkidu was wild. He had been made from clay by the goddess Aruru, the goddess of creation, and he lived among the animals of the steppe, eating grass and drinking from the watering holes alongside the gazelles and the lions. He knew nothing of civilization. He had never eaten bread. He had never worn clothes. A trapper who saw Enkidu at a watering hole was terrified. He went to Gilgamesh in Uruk and reported what he had seen. Gilgamesh, intrigued, sent out a woman named Shamhat to civilize Enkidu. She spent 6 days and 7 nights with him in the wilderness, and when it was over, Enkidu found that the animals who had been his companions now fled from him. He had become something different. He had become human. Shamhat led Enkidu to a shepherd's camp, and there he learned to eat bread and drink beer, the two foods that the Sumerians considered essential to civilized life. He washed himself. He put on clothing. A shepherd taught him to be a guard, to chase away the wolves and lions that preyed on the flocks. And then Enkidu heard about Gilgamesh. He heard about the king's arrogance and his power, and something stirred in him, some competitive fire, some desire to meet this person and test himself against him. He went to Uruk, and there, in the street of the city, the two greatest men in the world met for the first time. They fought. The ground shook, the walls trembled, and then, somehow, in the middle of their struggle, they stopped and looked at each other. and something passed between them that was stronger than either of them. They became friends, the closest of friends, the kind of friendship that you find maybe once in a life, if you are very lucky, the kind where you recognize in another person something that you had not known you were missing. Together, Gilgamesh and Enkidu went on great adventures. They traveled to the cedar forest in the west to fight the monstrous guardian Humbaba. They killed the bull of heaven, sent against them by the furious goddess Inanna, who had offered herself to Gilgamesh and been refused in terms that were not particularly diplomatic. But then the gods held council. Gilgamesh and Enkidu had offended too many divine powers. One of them had to die. And since it was unthinkable that Gilgamesh, the great king, should be the one to fall, it was Enkidu who sickened and died. And Gilgamesh, for the first time in his life, was undone. He wept. He could not stop weeping. He sat beside his friend's body and would not leave it until a maggot fell from Enkidu's nose, and he finally accepted that death was real, that even the best person he had ever known could simply cease to exist. And then fear took hold of him. If Enkidu could die, then so could he. He, Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine, the greatest king in the world, would someday be nothing but dust. He could not accept this. He would not accept this. And so began the second half of the epic, in which Gilgamesh sets out on a quest to find the secret of immortality. He wanders to the edges of the earth. He passes through mountains where the sun rises and sets. He crosses the waters of death to find Utnapishtim, the only human being whom the gods had ever granted immortality, the man who had survived the great flood. And Utnapishtim tells him the story of the flood, which is where that narrative comes from. How the gods decided to destroy humanity, and how the god Ea warned Utnapishtim and told him to build a great boat and fill it with his family and with one of every living creature. How the rains came for 7 days and 7 nights, and the world was drowned. How the boat came to rest on a mountain, and how Utnapishtim sent out birds to test whether the waters had receded. Sound familiar? It should. The Sumerian flood story predates the biblical account of Noah by at least 1,000 years. Scholars debate the relationship between the two stories, whether one influenced the other or whether both draw on an even older shared tradition. Perhaps the memory of an actual catastrophic flood in the ancient Near East, the flooding of the Black Sea, perhaps, or some massive inundation of the Mesopotamian plain. But after telling Gilgamesh the story of the flood, Utnapishtim tells him something he does not want to hear. He tells him that the gods did not grant immortality to him as a general principle. They gave it to him as a specific gift, and they will not give it again. Gilgamesh cannot have eternal life. There is, however, a plant, a magical plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, which will restore youth, if not immortality. Gilgamesh ties stones to his feet and descends to the bottom of the sea and finds it. He brings it up. He carries it with him, planning to share it with the elders of Uruk, to let them test it first. And then, camping for the night beside a pool, he leaves the plant unguarded for a moment while he sleeps. A snake smells the plant. The snake slithers to it and eats it. And as it eats, the snake sheds its skin and becomes young again. That is why snakes shed their skin, the Sumerians believed. That is why snakes seem to renew themselves while humans age and die, because a snake stole the chance at immortality that had been meant for us. Gilgamesh, waking to find the plant gone, sat down and wept. The epic tells us that he cried bitter tears, and then he stood up. He went back to Uruk, and when he arrived, he ran his hand along the city wall, and he felt its bricks, the great baked mud bricks that he had commissioned, that he had ordered his people to build, and he felt something shift in him. The walls would last. Long after he was gone, these walls would stand, and people would look at them and know that a great king had built them. Long after he was gone, the city he had governed would exist, and people would live in it and be sheltered by it and benefit from the canals he had dug and the laws he had made. This, the epic suggests, is the answer to mortality, not living forever yourself, but building something that lasts. It is a very human conclusion to reach, and it is an answer that the Sumerians themselves enacted, because they built cities and temples and wrote down their stories on clay, and those cities and those stories have lasted 5,000 years, And here we are tonight, listening to them. Now, as you settle deeper into your rest, let me take you into the daily life of a Sumerian city during the early dynastic period. Not the great kings and their epics, but the ordinary life that happened every day in those mud brick streets. Wake up before dawn, because the day begins early in a city without electric light. The heat starts building almost from the moment the sun clears the flat horizon, and the best work is done in the cool of the morning. Your house is made of mud brick. Almost everything in Sumer is made of mud brick, because there is very little stone in the southern plain and no forests at all. The bricks are made from the clay of the riverbed, mixed with sand and straw for strength, pressed into molds and left in the sun to dry. A good mud brick will last for years. A mud brick wall will last for decades. And when a house finally collapses, the rubble becomes the foundation for the next house, which is why the ancient cities of Mesopotamia rise in mounds above the plain. They are literally built on top of themselves, layer upon layer upon layer. Your house has a central courtyard open to the sky. The rooms around it are relatively dark to keep out the heat. The kitchen, if you can call it that, is a clay hearth against one wall. You cook bread, flatbread, baked directly on the clay, and you cook grains, barley mostly, in clay pots. You eat vegetables, onions and garlic, and leeks and beans. If you are fortunate, you eat fish, which is abundant in the rivers and the marshes. Meat is a luxury. You drink beer. A great deal of beer, actually. The Sumerians drank beer the way modern people drink water, and for some of the same reasons. The water of the rivers was not always safe to drink, but the fermentation process of beer killed many of the dangerous organisms. The Sumerians had a goddess of brewing, Ninkasi, and we have a hymn to her that is also, when decoded, a recipe for beer. It is the oldest beer recipe in the world. The beer was thick and grainy, not the clear golden liquid of a modern lager. It was drunk through a straw, a long reed straw that let you sip the liquid from below the layer of grain husks floating on top. Some of the oldest artistic images of Sumerians show groups of people sitting around a large jar, each with a straw, sharing beer together. There is something wonderfully human about that image. The market is in the street outside the temple precinct, and it opens with the day. Merchants display their goods on reed mats spread on the ground. You can buy cloth, linen, and wool, woven in a distinctive Sumerian style. You can buy pottery, beautifully made, despite the absence of any good clay-working stone for glazing. You can buy fish, dried or fresh. You can buy beer, different qualities and strengths, each with its own price. You pay not with coins, which haven't been invented yet, but with silver, weighed silver, in small amounts, measured on balanced scales. A standard shekel weight has emerged, allowing merchants in different cities to conduct transactions without misunderstanding. It is a remarkably sophisticated system for its time. Money, in the sense of a standard medium of exchange, was invented by the Sumerians. Lending at interest was invented by the Sumerians. We have clay tablets recording loans made in ancient Sumer, with the interest clearly specified, usually around 20% per year for silver, 33% for grain. If you failed to repay a loan, your creditor could take your children as debt slaves until the debt was worked off. The Sumerians also invented contract law, which was the attempt to regulate these economic relationships through agreed-upon rules that a court could enforce. They had professional judges, they had witnesses, they had a concept of evidence. Not our modern concept, to be sure, but something recognizably ancestral to it. They also, it must be said, had a concept of bribery, corruption, and official misconduct. The rulers of Lagash left inscriptions describing the reforms they had to implement because of the corruption of their predecessors. Officials had been taking bribes. They had been overcharging for services. They had been helping themselves to property that didn't belong to them. Nothing new under the sun. The scribal school is one of the most important institutions in any Sumerian city. It was called the Eduba, which means tablet house, and it was where the next generation of scribes was trained. Scribal education was long, difficult, and demanding. The students were almost certainly boys from relatively privileged families, because literacy was a path to high-status employment in the temple or palace administration, and the training required years of investment before a student became useful. The common people had no need of writing, and probably no access to the schools. The curriculum began with learning to write the signs of cuneiform script, hundreds of them, each one requiring practice. The students wrote on small clay tablets, using a stylus made from a reed. They wrote lists of animals, lists of trees, lists of types of cloth, lists of professions. They copied mathematical tables, learning to multiply and divide and work out areas and volumes. They copied texts of the standard literary works, the myths and hymns and wisdom literature that formed the core of educated Sumerian culture. We know the details of Sumerian education because we have the school texts, the practice tablets, with their careful writing, the mistakes crossed out, the marks of the teacher, but we also have something more vivid than that. We have a Sumerian essay, written by a student, describing a day at school. He was late, he was scolded. He hadn't practiced his writing well enough, and he was beaten. He was told that his lines weren't straight, and his Sumerian wasn't good enough, and he wasn't paying attention. He had a terrible day. He went home and told his father, who invited the teacher to dinner, gave him gifts and a fine meal, and praised him extravagantly. The next day, the teacher gave the boy a glowing evaluation. Some things are eternal. The temples of Sumer were not just places of worship, they were economic powerhouses. By the early dynastic period, the temples of each city owned substantial amounts of land. They employed large numbers of workers, priests, scribes, craftsmen, laborers. They operated the most important agricultural estates in the city's territory. They managed the most significant manufacturing operations, the textile workshops, where enormous quantities of cloth were produced, often by women who were essentially institutionalized workers, housed and fed by the temple in exchange for their labor. The relationship between the temple and the community it served was complex and not always comfortable. The temple was supposed to care for the poor and the vulnerable, to provide food in times of shortage and justice in times of dispute, and to some extent it did this. But the temple also extracted resources from the community in the form of offerings and taxes, and the people who ran the temple were not always as transparent about what they did with those resources as the people giving them might have wished. The god for whom the temple was built was understood to literally inhabit the building. The statue in the inner sanctum was not a symbol of the god, it was the god. The priests fed the statue 3 times a day. They dressed it in fine clothing. They played music for it. They carried it in procession through the streets on festival days. They took it to visit other temples when diplomatic relations required it. The relationship between a Sumerian city and its patron deity was understood as the relationship between a household and its lord. The city was the god's estate. The people who lived there were the god's workers. The temple was the god's house, and the king was the god's representative on earth, responsible for running the estate in the god's name. This made the king's position both extremely powerful and extremely precarious. If the city prospered, the king was doing the god's work well. If the city suffered, if the harvest was poor, or the rivers flooded at the wrong time, or a plague swept through the population, it was a sign that the king had failed in some way, that he had not properly maintained the god's favor. Kings in Sumer lived with the knowledge that disaster could strike at any time, and that when it did, they would be the ones held responsible. The ziggurats. I want to talk about the ziggurats, because they are perhaps the most iconic physical legacy of the Sumerians, the structures that, even in ruin, still define the landscape of southern Iraq. A ziggurat was a massive stepped pyramid, not a true pyramid in the Egyptian sense, because the sides were stepped rather than smooth, and the top was flat rather than pointed. It was built of mud brick, sometimes with baked brick on the exterior for durability. It could be 2 stages high, or 3 or 4 or more, each stage smaller than the one below, creating a stepped tower that rose dramatically above the flat plain. The ziggurat was the mountain in a land without mountains. The Sumerians believed that the gods lived on mountaintops, and that mountains were the meeting places between heaven and earth. But there were no mountains in southern Mesopotamia, so the Sumerians built their own. At the summit of the ziggurat was a small shrine, the highest point in the city, a place where the god could descend from heaven and the priests could ascend from earth. It was a ladder between the human and the divine. The most famous ziggurat is the one that may have inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. The Great Ziggurat of Babylon, built by the Babylonians, who came after the Sumerians. But the Sumerians built ziggurats in every major city, and some of them still partially stand today. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nana, was built around 2100 BCE and restored in the 6th century BCE, and restored again in the 1980s by Saddam Hussein, whose restoration is somewhat controversially visible today. It is about 60 feet tall in its current state, and in its original form it may have been twice that height. Standing at its base and looking up, you can feel the scale of it pressing down on you. This is the sensation the Sumerians intended. The mountain of the god is big, and you are small, and that difference is the point. Let your breathing slow now. You've been traveling a long time through this ancient world, and we've barely scratched the surface of the Sumerian story. But this is a good place to rest for a moment, to let the images settle. The flat plain with its rivers, the mud brick cities rising from the dust, the ziggurats catching the last light of the afternoon sun, the children bent over their clay tablets in the Adubba, the merchants weighing silver in the marketplace, the priests dressing the statue of the god in fine linen, 5,000 years ago. All of it real, all of it lived by actual human beings who woke up in the morning wondering how the day would go, who had friends and enemies and debts and loves and children they worried about. We will continue their story in a moment. The early dynastic period, for all its richness and complexity, was a world of competing city-states, each powerful in its own right, but none dominant over the others for long. One city would rise to supremacy, claim the title King of Kish, which was a general term for paramount ruler of Sumer, and then fall back as another city's strength grew. It was a world in equilibrium, balanced, if not peaceful. And it might have gone on indefinitely, these cities rising and falling in their slow cycles of conflict and recovery. But around 2350 BCE, something happened that shattered that equilibrium permanently. A man appeared. His name, or the name he gave himself, was Sargon. And he was not Sumerian. He came from the northern part of Mesopotamia, from the region called Akkad, which lay just above the Sumerian heartland. The people of Akkad spoke a different language, a Semitic language related to the ancient languages from which Hebrew and Arabic would eventually descend. They were not entirely different from the Sumerians, culturally. They had absorbed a great deal of Sumerian civilization over the centuries of contact, but they were distinct. The story of Sargon's origins is told in a myth that he may have invented or encouraged. He was, the story says, the illegitimate son of a priestess who could not acknowledge him. She placed him in a basket sealed with bitumen and set him on the waters of the Euphrates. He was found downstream by a gardener named Aki, who raised him as his own son. If this sounds familiar, it should. The story of a great leader who was placed in a basket on a river as a baby and rescued downstream is one of the most widely distributed myths in the ancient world. It appears in the story of Moses and in the stories of several other ancient heroes. Scholars debate whether Sargon's story influenced later versions or whether all of them draw on a common pattern of storytelling about divinely protected rulers. What is less mythological is what Sargon actually did. Starting from the city of Kish, he launched a military campaign that was unlike anything the ancient Near East had seen before. He didn't just defeat one city and claim its tribute. He defeated city after city, all the way down the Euphrates, and then he did something that no one had done before. He held on to what he had taken. He created an empire, the first empire in human history. He marched all the way to the Persian Gulf, washed his weapons in the sea, a symbolic gesture of having conquered everything between the mountains and the ocean, and he turned around and marched back and kept going, up through Syria and into Anatolia, perhaps all the way to the Mediterranean coast. The empire of Akkad stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Nothing like it had ever existed. And to run it, Sargon needed administrators. He placed his own people, Akkadian speakers, in positions of authority throughout the empire. He imposed Akkadian as the language of administration. He standardized weights and measures across the empire. He created, for the first time, a standing army. soldiers who were paid to fight full-time, rather than farmers who took up weapons when called upon. He also did something deeply personal that had consequences he probably didn't foresee. He appointed his daughter as the high priestess of the moon god at the great city of Ur. Her name was Enheduanna, and she was the first named author in human history. We know her name, we have her works, hymns to the goddess Inanna, poems to the moon god Nana, texts that are not just religious formulas but genuine literature, personal and vivid, and shot through with real emotion. In one of her hymns, she describes being driven out of her temple by a rebel who had overthrown her father's authority for a time. She addresses Inanna directly, with something that sounds remarkably like accusation and despair. "You are not here, and I am driven out. I am crying to you." Enheduanna got her temple back. Sargon's empire held, and for 2 generations after Sargon's death, the Akkadian Empire continued under his sons and grandsons, reaching its greatest extent under his grandson Naram-Sin, who declared himself not just king but a god, placing the divine symbol of a horned helmet above his own name in inscriptions. This was new. The Sumerian kings had been representatives of the gods, not gods themselves. Naram-Sin was claiming something more. It didn't go well. A stele, a carved stone monument, survives from the reign of Naram-Sin that shows him climbing a mountain over the bodies of his enemies, his helmet crowned with divine horns, larger than all the other figures in the composition. It is a magnificent piece of propaganda art. But there is another stele from around the same era, the stele of the vultures, which shows the aftermath of a battle, with a god holding a net full of defeated enemies while vultures pick at the bodies. Victory and slaughter, eternally intertwined. The Akkadian Empire fell around 2154 BCE. The reasons for its fall have been debated by scholars for over a century. The traditional account blamed an invasion from the east, a mountain people called the Gutians, who swept down from the Zagros Mountains and destroyed the Akkadian state. The Gutians are described in Sumerian texts in deeply unflattering terms. A mountain people without culture or understanding, who eat raw flesh and act like dogs. This is the language of people describing an existential enemy. But modern archaeology suggests a more complex picture. There is evidence, preserved in ancient sediment, cores taken from the lake beds of northern Syria, of a major drought event around 2200 BCE, a period of significantly reduced rainfall that would have devastated the agricultural regions that supplied the empire's food. The drought appears to have been severe enough to drive population movements, and the Gutians may have been part of a larger pattern of people migrating out of regions that could no longer support them. Climate change, in other words. The earliest recorded collapse of a complex society due at least in part to climate change. The Gutian period is described in Sumerian sources as a time of chaos and suffering. Kings came and went rapidly. Trade collapsed. The infrastructure of canals fell into disrepair. The great cities diminished. And then something remarkable happened. Out of the chaos, Sumer rose again. The city of Lagash, under a ruler named Gudea, experienced what seems to have been a genuine renaissance in the period just before and after 2100 BCE. Gudea was a prolific builder of temples and a notable patron of the arts. The statues of him that survive are among the most beautiful sculptures of the ancient world. Serene figures with clasped hands and thoughtful expressions, wearing a distinctive woolen cap. He looks, somehow, like a thoughtful bureaucrat, which in the best sense of the word is probably what he was. Gudea's inscriptions are remarkably personal. He tells us about his dreams, in which the gods instructed him to build temples. He tells us about the materials he gathered: cedar from the mountains of Lebanon, diorite from distant quarries, copper from the Gulf region. He tells us about the workers and the planning and the prayers. He sounds, across 4,000 years, like a man who genuinely cared about what he was doing. But the real glory of this period came slightly later, with what historians call the Third Dynasty of Ur, or Ur III. Beginning around 2112 BCE, the city of Ur rose to dominate all of Mesopotamia, creating what was in many ways the most completely organized state that the ancient world had yet produced. The king who founded this dynasty was Ur-Nammu. He was a great military leader and a great builder. He built or completed ziggurats in several cities, including the Great Ziggurat of Ur. He issued the first known law code in human history. The law code of Ur-Nammu predates the more famous code of Hammurabi by 3 centuries, and it is fascinating, both for what it includes and for what it doesn't. It includes fines for various offences, rather than the Talion-style punishments, an eye for an eye, that would dominate later Mesopotamian law. If you cut off someone's foot, you pay a fine. If you cut off someone's nose, you pay a different fine. There are provisions for slaves and for free people, different standards for different social classes, which is not particularly admirable from a modern perspective, but was entirely typical of ancient legal thinking. The code also reveals something about Sumerian values that I find touching. There are provisions explicitly protecting widows and orphans. There are rules against officials abusing their power. There are restrictions on the wealthy, taking advantage of the poor. This is not a society of pure might makes right. There is a sense, expressed in the law, that the strong have an obligation to the weak, that power comes with responsibility, that a just king is one who protects the vulnerable. Not perfectly realized, of course. Nothing ever is. But the aspiration is there, in the clay. The Ur-3 state was, in administrative terms, extraordinary. The sheer volume of written records it produced is staggering. Tens of thousands of clay tablets documenting the movement of goods, the assignment of labor, the payment of rations, the management of livestock, the completion of construction projects. The Ur-3 bureaucracy had achieved something that almost no other pre-modern state managed: total accounting. They tracked everything, every ox, every bundle of reeds, every day of labor by every worker, every silver shekel paid and received. This was not just organizational neatness, it was a political necessity. The Ur-3 state controlled vast territories and had to coordinate their resources to support its armies and its building programs and its religious obligations. Without this meticulous accounting, the whole system would fall apart. We know the names of individual workers who appear in these records, people who received their daily ration of barley and oil in exchange for specific tasks. We know about a man who spent 30 days transporting stones. We know about a woman who spent 40 days weaving cloth. We know about a child listed among the labor force who received a smaller ration commensurate with their smaller capacity for work. These are not great heroes. They are the people who built civilization by showing up every day and doing the work that needed doing. The city of Ur itself, during this period, was a place of genuine splendor. The Great Ziggurat stood at the center, dominating the city as it had for generations. Around it clustered the temple complexes, the administrative buildings, the storehouses filled with grain and oil and cloth. Beyond the sacred precincts stretched the residential neighborhoods, the streets of mud brick houses, the workshops of craftsmen and the stalls of merchants. Ur was a major port city, connected to the Persian Gulf by a system of canals that allowed seagoing ships to reach it, bringing goods from as far away as the Indus Valley civilization in what is now Pakistan and the lands around the Persian Gulf coast. The Royal Cemetery of Ur, excavated by the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, revealed the extraordinary wealth of this civilization and simultaneously something deeply disturbing about it. The royal tombs were built in stone, which was remarkable in a land where stone had to be imported at great cost. They were filled with objects of breathtaking beauty. A golden helmet of exquisite craftsmanship, decorated with the curling hair of its wearer, rendered in beaten gold. A golden harp with the head of a bull, made from gold and lapis lazuli. A game board of wood, decorated with shell and lapis. Jewelry of gold and carnelian, and lapis lazuli. The blue of lapis lazuli appears everywhere in these tombs. This deep, intense, celestial blue was the most prized color in the ancient world, associated with the sky and with divinity and with royalty. And every piece of lapis lazuli in ancient Mesopotamia came from a single source, the mines of Badakhshan in what is now northeastern Afghanistan. Consider that for a moment. The lapis lazuli in the royal tombs of Ur traveled 3,000 miles to get there, passing through the hands of countless traders across mountains and deserts and rivers. The fact that it was worth importing tells us how wealthy and how well-connected ancient Ur was. But the beauty of the royal tombs is shadowed by something else. The tombs were not built for one person. They were built for a king or queen and their entire court. In one of the tombs, designated the Great Death Pit, Woolley found 68 women and 6 men, all richly dressed, some still holding musical instruments, laid out in neat rows. They had died in the tomb. Some of them, Woolley believed, had drunk poison voluntarily. Others may have been killed. We do not know with certainty what the Sumerians believed about this practice. We have no texts that clearly explain it. The most common interpretation is that these were servants accompanying their royal master or mistress into the afterlife, to continue serving them there as they had served them in life. It is one of those moments in studying ancient history when beauty and horror coexist so completely that it is impossible to separate them. The golden helmet, the rows of bodies, the lapis lazuli catching the light of Woolley's lantern for the first time in 4,000 years. The third dynasty of reached its peak under the king Shulgi, who ruled for 48 years and who seems to have been a genuinely remarkable individual. He styled himself the greatest of all athletes, boasting that he had run from Nippur to and back in a single day, a distance of roughly 160 miles. This claim is, to put it gently, not supported by modern physiological understanding, but it tells us something about Shulgi's self-presentation. He also claimed to be literate, which was genuinely unusual for a king of his time. Most kings left the actual writing to their scribes. Shulgi boasted of being able to read and write cuneiform himself, and to compose hymns in his own honor. The hymns to Shulgi that survive are extravagant in their praise. He is compared to a great storm, to a raging lion, to a shining moon. He is called the shepherd of the people, the builder of the land, the one who loves justice. This was the standard royal self-presentation of the ancient world. But underneath the rhetoric, the historical record shows a ruler who was genuinely effective. The Ur-III state under Shulgi was well organized, its army effective, its administration tight. Trade flourished, building continued, the law was enforced. And then, gradually, things began to unravel. The pressures came from multiple directions. From the east, the Elamites, an ancient people from the region of modern Iran, began pressing against the empire's borders. From the west, a new wave of semi-nomadic people, the Amorites, began moving into Mesopotamia from the Syrian desert. The Amorites were not conquerors in the military sense, at least not initially. They filtered in slowly, finding employment as laborers and soldiers in the cities, settling in the countryside, gradually becoming part of the population. But their presence changed the balance of Mesopotamian society, and the Ur-III kings viewed them with deep suspicion. A wall was built, a great defensive wall stretching across Mesopotamia from the Tigris to the Euphrates to keep the Amorites out. The wall failed. The Amorites came anyway. By around 2004 BCE, the empire had weakened to the point where its enemies sensed opportunity. The Elamites invaded from the east. They captured Ur. They took the last king of Ur-III, Ibbi-Sin, captive back to Elam. And the city of Ur, the jewel of Sumerian civilization, was sacked. A Sumerian poet, or perhaps several poets, wrote a series of laments for this catastrophe. The lament for the destruction of Ur is one of the most moving texts from the ancient world, a long, anguished poem in which the city personified as a woman weeps for what she has lost. The wind howled around me. I am not able to sleep. The bitterness of my destruction moved before me. The people of my city are like birds that are driven away. My young women and young men are led away into captivity. And my great children, who did not leave me, who were not taken captive, lie scattered in their blood. Reading those lines, knowing that they were written by a person who had seen real destruction, who had watched a city they loved be torn apart, the words become almost unbearable. 5,000 years ago, the same grief, the same loss, the same desperate need to write it down before it was forgotten. After the fall of Ur, Mesopotamia fragmented again into competing kingdoms. But this time, the competing powers were no longer simply Sumerian. The Amorites established their own dynasties in the major cities. Isin and Larsa competed for dominance. The Elamites held portions of the east. The old Sumerian heartland became a contested periphery rather than a center. The Sumerian language, which had been losing ground to Akkadian for centuries, accelerated its retreat into specialized use. It became the language of the temple and the school, the language of sacred texts and literary tradition, preserved by scribes who learned it as a classical language, even as it died as a spoken tongue. Much like Latin in medieval Europe, it became the language of learning and religion long after it ceased to be anyone's mother tongue. The last texts we have that were clearly composed in Sumerian, as opposed to being copied from older originals, date to around 1700 BCE. After that, it becomes a dead language, kept alive in scribal schools, because the great literary tradition could not be abandoned. By the time of the Assyrian Empire, 1,000 years after Ur's fall, scholars were still copying and preserving Sumerian texts. They recognized, even then, that those tablets contained something irreplaceable. They were right. Let me rest your mind with the quieter details again for a while, as you drift towards sleep. The evening in a Sumerian city falls fast, as it does in all hot countries. The brutal sun drops toward the flat horizon, and the air cools with remarkable speed. In the streets, the merchants pack away their goods, and the children who have been playing in the dust are called inside. The smell of cooking drifts from the courtyards. In the temple precinct, the day's final rites are performed. The statue of the god is fed its evening meal. The lamps are lit, oil lamps of fired clay with a wick floating in the oil, casting a warm, slightly smoky light. The musicians play the final hymns of the day. And then the great wooden doors of the inner sanctuary are closed, and the god rests. Outside the temple, people find their own rest in various ways. The more prosperous families retire to the flat roofs of their houses, where the night breeze makes sleep more comfortable than the still air of the rooms below. They lay out their sleeping mats and look up at a sky that, without any artificial light for hundreds of miles, is a blaze of stars. The Sumerians were accomplished astronomers because in their flat landscape with its vast sky, the movements of the heavenly bodies were the most reliable calendar they had. They tracked the phases of the moon, which gave them their months. They tracked the rising and setting of Venus, which they called the Star of Inanna. They tracked the movements of the planets and the patterns of the stars. They divided the sky into constellations, many of which we still use today. The zodiac, that band of constellations through which the sun and moon and planets appear to move, was invented by the Mesopotamians. When you read your horoscope, you are using a system that originated on the banks of the Euphrates 5,000 years ago. The Sumerians believed that the movements of the heavenly bodies were communications from the gods, signs that could be read by those trained to interpret them. A lunar eclipse was particularly ominous. A bright comet was troubling. The appearance of certain planets in certain configurations indicated specific types of events on Earth. The king employed astronomers, called Baru priests, whose job was to observe the sky and interpret what they saw for the royal court. Their observations were recorded on clay tablets in meticulous detail, and those records are still being studied by modern scholars. Some of the astronomical observations in these tablets are remarkably accurate, achieved without any instruments other than the human eye and careful record-keeping over many generations. Looking up at the same stars the Sumerians watched, from the roof of a mud brick house, eating a flat piece of bread and drinking a cup of thick beer, a Sumerian farmer might have found the vastness of the sky comforting rather than frightening. The stars were orderly. They moved in patterns you could learn and predict. In a world where so much was uncertain, where the floods came and the droughts came and the armies of neighboring cities came, the stars at least were reliable. There is something calming about that. Let us talk about the gods. Because you cannot understand the Sumerians without understanding their relationship to the divine, and that relationship was unlike anything you might encounter in the major religions of the modern world. It was not a relationship of personal faith or private devotion. It was a relationship of employment. The Sumerians believed that the gods had created human beings for one reason: to work for them. The Sumerian word for human beings, lu, may derive from a root meaning worker. We were made to farm the land, to herd the cattle, to build the temples, to bake the bread and brew the beer and weave the cloth that the gods required. We were servants. This might sound demoralizing, but consider what it also meant. If humans were created by the gods to serve a purpose, then human life had a point. You were not here by accident. You were here because you were needed. The gods, with all their divine power, had decided that they required you specifically, your labor, your attention, your offerings. And in return for that labor, the gods were supposed to maintain the world. The floods should come at the right time and in the right amount. The rains should fall when needed. The herds should be fertile and the crops should be good. The gods were fulfilling their side of a contract. When things went wrong, it was either because humans had failed in their obligations, had not prayed properly, or offered enough, or maintained the temples as they should have, or because the gods were in conflict with each other, and the human world was suffering the collateral damage. The Sumerian pantheon was vast and complex, with hundreds of named deities, each responsible for specific aspects of the world. There were gods of specific cities, specific crafts, specific natural phenomena, but a few figures dominated the religious imagination of Sumer with particular force. An was the sky god, father of the gods, the most ancient and supreme divine authority. But An was so supreme, so remote, that he rarely appeared in the active stories of myth. He was like a constitutional monarch, powerful in theory but rarely the one actually making things happen. Enlil was the god of wind and storm and the breath of the earth. He was the active chief of the gods in most mythological contexts, the one who made decisions and gave orders. He was not a comfortable god. He was the one who decided to send the flood to destroy humanity. He was the one who controlled the fate of kings and cities. Enki was the god of wisdom and fresh water and magic. He was the trickster of the pantheon, the clever one, the one who found loopholes in divine decrees and helped human beings survive situations that the other gods intended to be fatal. It was Enki who warned Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, about the coming flood and told him to build a boat. It was Enki who came up with clever solutions to problems that Enlil had created. Inanna. Inanna deserves her own long conversation because she is one of the most complex and fascinating figures in all of ancient mythology. She was the goddess of love and war, of sex and conflict, of desire and domination. She was the morning star and the evening star, which the Sumerians knew were the same celestial body, the planet Venus. She was beautiful and terrifying, generous and cruel, a force of nature that you approached with awe and more than a little fear. The myths of Inanna are among the richest in Sumerian literature. She descends to the underworld to visit her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead, and at each of the 7 gates of the underworld, she is stripped of one of her divine garments or insignia. Arriving in the land of the dead, naked and defenseless, she is killed. Her body is hung on a hook. Above, without the goddess of fertility and desire, the world stops working. Animals stop mating, plants stop growing, humans lose interest in each other. The gods send envoys to rescue her. She is brought back to life. But the laws of the underworld are absolute. No one who has entered the realm of the dead can leave without sending a substitute. And so Inanna, returning to the upper world, must choose someone to take her place in the land of the dead. Who will it be? She passes through city after city, and in each city she finds her loyal followers weeping for her, dressed in rags of mourning. She cannot take them, but when she reaches Uruk, she finds her husband Dumuzi, the shepherd god, sitting on a throne in splendid clothing, apparently unconcerned about her absence. Furious, Inanna points at him. Take this one, and the demons carry Dumuzi away to the land of the dead. The story has a partial resolution. Dumuzi's sister, Geshtinanna, in an act of love and sacrifice, offers to spend half the year in the underworld, in her brother's place, so that he can return to the living world for 6 months. And so Dumuzi spends half the year in the underworld and half the year in the land of the living, and this cycle of his presence and absence corresponds, the Sumerians believed, to the cycles of the seasons, the alternation of fertility and barrenness, growth and dormancy. This is not just a charming myth, it is an attempt to explain the fundamental rhythms of the natural world in terms of divine personalities and divine conflict. The world works the way it does because the gods made choices, had desires, acted on them, and the consequences ripple through time. It is a way of finding meaning in the chaos of the natural world. The seasons are not random. They are the aftermath of a story. The myth of Enki and the world order is another essential Sumerian text because it describes how civilization itself was organized. Enki, the god of wisdom, travels through the world assigning roles to everything. He blesses the rivers and tells them to flood regularly. He blesses the fields and tells them to produce grain. He blesses the pickaxe and the plow. He blesses the brick mold. He assigns gods to oversee each domain. In this myth, civilization is not a human achievement, but a divine gift. The plowing of fields, the baking of bread, the weaving of cloth, the carrying of bricks to build temples, all of these activities were not invented by human beings through their own cleverness. They were gifts from the gods, specifically assigned, each with its own divine guardian. This is a deeply conservative vision of the world. Everything that is because the gods arranged it to be that way. The role of humanity is not to innovate, but to maintain. Not to improve, but to serve. And yet the Sumerians were extraordinary innovators. Almost every major invention I have mentioned tonight, writing, the wheel, the city, the law code, irrigation agriculture, beer, was created in Sumer. How do you square the conservative ideology of serving the gods with the radical creativity of actually building civilization? I think the answer is that human beings always find ways to be creative within the constraints of whatever ideology surrounds them. The Sumerian scribe who invented a new way to press the stylus into clay to represent a new type of sound was not thinking of himself as an innovator. He was solving a practical problem. But the solution was innovative. Civilization is built by people solving practical problems, one after another, generation after generation. Each solution creating new problems that require new solutions. The ideological frame around that activity matters much less than the activity itself. There is a Sumerian poem that I want to tell you about, because it is one of the strangest and most arresting texts from the ancient world. It is sometimes called the debate between winter and summer, and it takes the form of an argument between two brothers, personifications of the two seasons. Winter argues that he is more important because the cold and the rain he brings are what make the land fertile again after the dryness of summer. Summer argues that he is more important because without the warmth and light of summer, nothing that was planted in winter would ever grow. They argue eloquently and at length, each making excellent points, and in the end, the god Enlil has to settle the dispute. He rules in favor of summer. What I love about this poem is that it takes a genuine question about the natural world, which season actually matters more to the agricultural cycle, and answers it through storytelling, through the device of giving the seasons personalities and letting them argue their case. It is both myth and practical wisdom, both entertainment and education. The Sumerians loved debates. There are many debate poems in Sumerian literature. Debate between the pickaxe and the plow, debate between sheep and grain, debate between bird and fish. In each case, two things that might be considered rivals are given voices and allowed to make their best arguments, and a god decides which is superior. This genre says something interesting about Sumerian intellectual culture. They were comfortable with complexity. They recognized that most questions don't have simple answers. They created a literary form that let them explore that complexity through personification and dialogue. It is not so far from the Socratic dialogues of ancient Greece, which appeared about 2,000 years later. The question of the relationship between Sumer and other ancient civilizations is one that scholars have debated extensively. We know that there was contact between ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, though the nature of that contact and the degree of influence are disputed. Some architectural and artistic elements that appear in early Egypt look remarkably similar to Mesopotamian originals, suggesting borrowing or at least shared inspiration. The idea of writing may have traveled from Mesopotamia to Egypt, though the Egyptians developed their own system independently enough that the question is genuinely open. We know that there was contact between Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley civilization, which flourished in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India from roughly 2600 to 1900 BCE. Seals from the Indus Valley have been found in Mesopotamian archaeological sites, and Mesopotamian materials have turned up in Indus Valley contexts. There was active trade between these two worlds, passing through the Persian Gulf and along the coast. We know that there was contact between Mesopotamia and what are now Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Iran, because the archaeological evidence for those connections is overwhelming. What is harder to know is how much of the intellectual and cultural achievement of Sumer spread outward through these contacts. How much of what we think of as the foundations of Western civilization actually originated in those mud brick cities on the banks of the Euphrates? More than we are accustomed to acknowledging, probably. The 60-second minute and the 60-minute hour come from Sumer, which used a base 60 mathematical system. We still divide circles into 360 degrees because the Sumerians did. We still use a calendar based on the lunar months that Sumerian astronomers calculated. The zodiac signs that appear in modern horoscopes were defined in Mesopotamia. The story of the Great Flood, which appears in the traditions of dozens of cultures around the world, appears first in Sumer. The roots go deep, deeper than most of us know. The period after the fall of Ur III was not the end of Sumerian culture, but it was the beginning of the end of Sumer as a political entity. For the next several centuries, Mesopotamia was contested by a series of kingdoms and dynasties that incorporated much of Sumerian tradition, while being themselves increasingly non-Sumerian in leadership and language. The Isin-Larsa period, which followed the fall of Ur III, saw the cities of Isin and Larsa competing for dominance over the Sumerian heartland. Both claimed the legacy of the third dynasty of Ur. Both maintained the temples and the scribal schools and the literary traditions. The Sumerian language was still used for religious and literary purposes. The myths were still copied. The hymns were still sung. But the kings of this era were increasingly Amorite in origin, descendants of the nomadic people who had filtered in from the west. They adopted Sumerian culture enthusiastically, worshipped the Sumerian gods, sponsored Sumerian literature, but Sumerian was not their mother tongue. Then, around 1894 BCE, a new power rose in the north. The city of Babylon, which had been a relatively minor settlement, gained a new dynasty under an Amorite ruler, and in 1763 BCE, the sixth king of this dynasty, a ruler named Hammurabi, conquered all of Mesopotamia, including the old Sumerian heartland. Hammurabi is famous today primarily for his law code. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on a large black stone stele that now stands in the Louvre in Paris, is one of the most comprehensive legal documents from the ancient world. It is not the first law code, as we have seen. The Sumerians preceded it by centuries, but it is the most complete and the most systematic, and it draws heavily on the legal traditions of Sumer. Reading the Code of Hammurabi, you see the inheritance of everything the Sumerians developed: the protections for widows and orphans, the regulations of trade and contracts, the standards for weights and measures, the procedures for courts and witnesses and evidence. The Babylonian Empire absorbed Sumer and translated its achievements into a new cultural context. Sumerian myths were translated into Akkadian. Sumerian mathematical and astronomical knowledge was preserved and extended. Sumerian religious traditions were adapted, the Sumerian gods given Akkadian names or merged with Babylonian equivalents. This is how civilizations actually die and don't die, not in a single catastrophic moment, usually, but in a long, slow transformation, the substance preserved even as the form changes. The knowledge carried forward even as the people who created it are absorbed into something new. Let me slow down now and take you into a more contemplative space, because I want to talk about what it means that all of this was lost and then found again. Think about this. For more than 2,000 years, from roughly the time of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE until the middle of the 19th century CE, no one alive on the face of the earth knew that the Sumerians had ever existed. Not the Romans, not the medieval scholars, not the Renaissance humanists who revived so much of ancient classical learning, not the Enlightenment philosophers who thought they were rediscovering the foundations of civilization. The Sumerians were gone. Their language was dead. Their writing was illegible. Their cities were mounds of dust. Their stories had been absorbed into the traditions of later cultures so thoroughly that no one recognized the origin. The world operated for 2,000 years, without knowing that there had been an even older world beneath the one it knew. And then, in the 1840s and 1850s, archaeologists began digging into those mounds in what was then the Ottoman province of Mesopotamia, modern Iraq. They found walls, they found statues, they found clay tablets covered in strange, wedge-shaped marks. The tablets were the key. Deciphering cuneiform was one of the great intellectual achievements of the 19th century, accomplished through careful comparison of trilingual inscriptions that used cuneiform alongside other scripts that were already understood. Once the code was cracked, the tablets could speak, and they said things that changed everything. They said there had been a civilization older than Egypt, older than Greece, older than anything the modern world had suspected. They said there had been cities before the cities we knew about. There had been kings and laws and literature and astronomy and mathematics before we thought such things were possible. George Smith, the same scholar who was so overcome by the flood story that he ran into the street, spent years translating tablets from the British Museum's collection, working under difficult conditions in a badly lit room on a government salary that barely covered his expenses. He was not a wealthy gentleman scholar, but a working man who had come to archaeology through an almost obsessive interest in cuneiform that he had developed as a young man. In 1872, he stood before the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London and read out his translation of the flood tablet from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the account of a great flood sent by the gods, a man chosen to build a boat, animals taken aboard, a dove sent out to find land. The room was electrified. The Prime Minister, William Gladstone, was present. The audience understood immediately what they were hearing. This was a version of the Noah story, and it was older than the Bible. George Smith died in 1876 of dysentery while on an excavation in Syria. He was 36 years old. He had spent his entire adult life in the pursuit of a lost civilization, and he had found it, but he never got to see what would be made of that finding in the century and a half that followed. The full picture of Sumerian civilization that we have today took 150 years of excavation, translation, and scholarly argument to assemble. It is still being assembled. New tablets are still being translated. New sites are still being excavated, though the situation in Iraq over the past several decades has been devastating for archaeology, with widespread looting of sites and the deliberate destruction of artifacts by various armed groups. The Mesopotamian marshes themselves, the ancient homeland of the people who built the first settlements, were deliberately drained by Saddam Hussein in the 1990s as a political measure against the people who lived there, reducing them to a fraction of their original extent. Since the fall of Saddam's government, partial restoration has been attempted, and portions of the marshes have recovered. But the ancient ecosystem that gave birth to civilization is greatly diminished. There is a painful irony in that. The land that produced the first civilization has had difficulty finding peace and stability in the modern world. Let me take you back, one last time, to the world we have been inhabiting tonight. It is evening in a Sumerian city. The year is perhaps 2500 BCE, the height of the early dynastic period, when the cities of Sumer are at their most confident, their most prosperous, their most themselves. The ziggurat catches the last light of the setting sun, its mud brick flanks glowing warm orange and red. The sounds of the city are softening. The merchants have gone home. The craftsmen have put away their tools. The scribes have set their final tablets aside to dry. In the temple precinct, a priestess of Inanna is preparing for the evening rites. She wears a robe of fine linen and a headdress of gold and lapis lazuli, that celestial blue imported from the mountains of Afghanistan. She carries a small clay lamp. The sound of flutes drifts from the inner courtyard. Outside the temple walls, a child is being put to bed in a mud brick house. The child asks to hear a story, and a parent, sitting in the lamplight, begins to tell one, perhaps the story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, of the two greatest friends in the world and their adventures in the cedar forest. The child listens, eyes growing heavy, the lamplight steady and warm. In the fields beyond the city walls, a farmer is walking home along the edge of a canal, watching the reflection of the first stars appear in the dark water. He is tired in the good way that comes from a day of renolgak. his body used up and ready for rest. He stops for a moment at the canal's bank and drinks, scooping the water in his hands. The canal is a gift. His grandfather's grandfather helped to dig it. Without it, this land would be dust. With it, it produces grain that feeds the city and fills the temple storehouses and goes out on boats to distant places. He stands for a moment in the growing darkness, looking at the ziggurats on the horizon, that squared mountain in a land without mountains, the house of the god who protects this city and its people. He does not know that in 4,000 years, someone will be lying in a darkened room in a world he cannot imagine, listening to the story of his world, holding it gently in their mind as they drift towards sleep. But we know, and there is something in that knowing that feels important, something that connects us across all those thousands of years and all those lost centuries and all that silence, to the people who built the first cities, who wrote the first words, who looked up at the same stars we look at and felt the same mixture of smallness and wonder that we feel. They are not so far away. They are right here, in the words we use, in the hours we keep, in the laws we live by, in the stories we tell our children at night when the lamp is low and sleep is near. The Sumerians did not survive as a distinct people or a distinct language, but what they built is in the bones of everything that came after. And what they felt, the awe and the anxiety and the love and the curiosity and the desire to understand and to record and to make something that would last, that is not so different from what you feel. That is not so different from what I feel, putting these words together in the hope that they might carry something worth carrying into the quiet space between wakefulness and sleep. Let the story of Sumer settle into you now, the flat plain under the enormous sky, the rivers dark and full in the spring, low and green in the summer, the canals spreading across the land like the veins of a living thing, carrying water to the roots of civilization, the mud brick houses warm in the afternoon heat, cool in the narrow shade of their interior courtyards, the ziggurats rising from the cities like declarations of human ambition and divine devotion, the scribes bent over their tablets, pressing their styli into the soft clay, making marks that will carry their thoughts forward 5,000 years. The merchants weighing silver on their balance scales, the children spelling out the signs of cuneiform in the adaba, being scolded and praised and shaped into the administrators and priests who will keep the machinery of civilization running for another generation. The poets composing hymns to Inanna, to Nana, to Enlil and Enki and An, the astronomers watching the sky from the top of the ziggurat, recording the movements of the planets with careful attention, building a picture of the cosmos that will eventually become the astronomical tradition of the ancient world. The kings laying out their grand building projects, the temples that will be the largest structures their people have ever seen, the law codes that will define what it means to live in an ordered society rather than a world of pure force. And the ordinary people, the farmers and the fishers and the weavers and the brewers and the boat builders and the brick makers and the canal diggers, the people whose names we mostly don't know, but whose work made everything else possible, going about their lives in the shadow of the ziggurats, doing what needed to be done, day after day, generation after generation. This was civilization. For the first time, in its first version, complicated and unjust and brilliant and ordinary and full of suffering and full of beauty, the way all civilizations are, the way ours is, if we are honest. The Sumerians were not perfect. They kept slaves. Their kings were often brutal. Their gods were capricious, and their religious demands were heavy. The gap between the wealthy and the poor was real and enforced by law. But they built something that had never existed before, and it was worth building, and it lasted, and the world we live in tonight is built, however many times removed, on the foundation they laid. The very last texts in the Sumerian language that scholars have identified as original compositions, rather than copies of older works, date to around 1700 BCE. By this time, the Sumerian heartland is under Babylonian rule. The great cities of early Sumer are still inhabited, but much diminished. The canals still flow, but some of the land has been slowly lost to salinization. The accumulation of salts in the soil from centuries of irrigation without adequate drainage, which eventually makes the soil unable to support crops. Salinization, the slow poisoning of the land by the very thing that had made it fertile. The canals that had made civilization possible were, over centuries, contributing to its decline in the south. Agricultural yields in the Sumerian heartland fell. Some areas were abandoned as no longer worth farming. The center of Mesopotamian civilization had already shifted northward, to Babylon and later to Assyria, away from the original Sumerian cities. The old heartland became a periphery. The great ziggurat of Ur, rebuilt by the Babylonians and the Assyrians, and finally by the last Babylonian king, Nabonidus, in the 6th century BCE, was eventually abandoned when the waters of the Euphrates shifted and the port of Ur became inaccessible to ships. A city that had been a major trading hub for thousands of years simply dried up because the river moved. The last inhabitants of ancient Ur walked away sometime around 300 BCE. The desert moved in. The wind covered the streets with sand. The rains, infrequent as they were, softened the mud brick until it crumbled. And the walls fell, and the fallen walls became mounds, and the mounds were covered with more sand, and the desert was flat and featureless and silent, where the greatest city of the ancient world had been, and there it lay, for 2,000 years, waiting. In 1922, Leonard Woolley arrived at the mound, called Tel El Mukaya, the Mound of Pitch, which is what the place had been called by the local Arabs for as long as anyone could remember. They didn't know why it was called that. The pitch was part of the ancient construction, bitumen used as waterproofing, seeping through the soil over centuries. Woolley spent 12 years excavating Ur. He was a gifted archaeologist and also a gifted writer, which means we have unusually vivid accounts of what it felt like to work at the site. He describes peeling back layers of history, finding levels of occupation going back thousands of years, each layer revealing a different moment in the city's long life. He found the royal tombs. He found the ziggurat, much of which still stood. He found the residential neighborhoods. He found the harbor district. He found, buried deep in the stratified layers, a thick band of waterlogged clay with no artifacts in it at all, which he believed was evidence of the biblical flood. Later, archaeologists have been more skeptical of this interpretation. The flood deposit appears to be a local event rather than the catastrophic inundation of the entire region. But the discovery generated enormous public excitement at the time. Woolley was a master of public communication, which was important because he was working with funding from both the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, institutions that needed their donors to remain interested. He wrote popular books and gave public lectures and corresponded with newspapers. He made Ur famous in a way that it had not been for 2,000 years. The artifacts from the royal tombs were divided between the British Museum in London and the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, where they remain today. The golden helmet, the lapis lazuli game board, the bull-headed harp, these objects are still displayed in those museums, and millions of people have seen them standing in front of glass cases and looking at things made 5,000 years ago by hands that were not so different from their own. That is a kind of communion across time that I find deeply moving. Before I take you to the final resting place of our story tonight, I want to share with you one more piece of Sumerian literature. Not a great myth or a royal hymn, but something simpler, something more personal. It is called A Dialogue Between a Man and His God. It dates to around 2000 BCE, from the period we have been exploring tonight, and it is a letter or a prayer from a person who is suffering and cannot understand why. The man speaks directly to his God, not with the formal language of temple ritual, but with the raw language of personal pain. He has been ill. He has lost his social standing. His friends have deserted him. He feels completely alone. He says that he has called to his God, and his God has not answered. He has wept, and there has been no comfort. He is confused about what he did wrong, because he cannot identify any wrongdoing in himself. He has, as far as he knows, honored the gods correctly. He has made the right offerings. He has lived as he was supposed to live, and still, this has happened to him. The text is sometimes called the Sumerian Job, because it raises the same question that the biblical book of Job will raise 1,000 years later. Why do good people suffer? In the Sumerian version, the man's God eventually answers. He tells the man to keep praying. He tells him that his suffering has a purpose, even if the man cannot see it. And in the end, the god intervenes to end the man's suffering, and the man's health and fortune are restored. It is not a fully satisfying answer to the question it raises. The existence of undeserved suffering remains unexplained. But the act of raising the question, 5,000 years ago, in writing, in a text preserved and copied by scribes who recognized it as worth preserving, tells us something important about the Sumerians. They were asking the same questions we are still asking. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why does the universe seem so indifferent to our merit and our suffering? What does it mean to live a good life in a world that doesn't reliably reward goodness? We have not answered these questions. We have not come close to answering them, but we have been asking them, in writing, for at least 5,000 years. And that continuity, that unbroken thread of human beings wrestling with the hardest questions, reaching back through Babylon and Ur and the first mud brick cities on the banks of the Euphrates, is one of the things that makes studying the ancient world feel not like a journey into the foreign and the strange, but like coming home. And so, as the night deepens around you and the sounds of the modern world grow distant, let this be where we rest. Not at the fall of Ur, not at the sacking of the city, or the carrying off of its last king in chains. Let us rest, instead, at a quieter moment, an ordinary moment. It is late at night in the city of Ur. The year is perhaps 2050 BCE, just before the fall, when the city was still at the height of its power. The air has cooled. The ziggurat is a dark mass against a sky thick with stars. In the harbour district, a single lamp burns on a boat moored to the dock. The water laps against the hull with a soft, rhythmic sound. A scribe is working late. He has a delivery to make in the morning, a letter pressed into clay, a routine business communication about a shipment of wool. He is tired. His lamp is guttering. His stylus is worn and needs to be resharpened. But he finishes the tablet, smooths the edge with a damp finger, and sets it down to harden. He does not think of himself as living in a civilization. He does not know he is at the height of something. He does not know that in 200 years, his city will be sacked and his way of life will begin to dissolve. He is just a scribe, finishing a letter. Late at night, tired, he puts out the lamp. He finds his mat in the dark room. He lies down and sleeps. As you can sleep now, the world is old, and it was here before you, and it will be here after you, and in between it gave the Sumerians their moment, and it is giving you yours, and that is enough. That has always been enough. The stars turn overhead, the rivers flow to the sea, and somewhere, in the soft, dark ground of southern Iraq, the clay tablets of the Sumerians lie waiting, patient as they have always been, carrying their wedge-shaped marks, their receipts, and their hymns, and their myths, and their love songs, and their law codes, and their laments, and their questions, carrying all of it forward through the years towards some future reader who will pick them up and feel, across the impossible distance of 5,000 years, the warmth of another human hand. Good night, sleep well, and thank you for being here. There is something that I have not yet told you about the Sumerians, something that tends to surprise people when they first encounter it, and it is this. The Sumerians were funny. Not in the way we might expect ancient peoples to be funny, not with the heavy irony of Greek tragedy or the satirical wit of Roman comedy, but with a direct, earthy humor that sometimes comes out of nowhere in the midst of a solemn religious text and catches you completely off guard. There are riddles preserved on Sumerian tablets. One of them asks, a house with a foundation of silver, a roof of gold. What is it? The answer is an egg. Another asks, what is it that goes through the city and cannot be caught? The answer is the wind. There are fables, little stories that make a moral point through the adventures of animals and unlikely characters, not entirely unlike Aesop's fables, though they predate Aesop by 1,000 years. A fox brags about his knowledge and cleverness, and the other animals ask him to demonstrate it, and he cannot. A bird makes a nest in a reed, and the flood rises, and the nest is destroyed. And the bird reproaches the sky for its cruelty, and the sky says nothing, because the sky never does. There are jokes, real jokes with punchlines. The oldest known joke in human history comes from a Sumerian tablet dating to about 1900 BCE, and it goes like this. Something which has never occurred since time immemorial. A young woman who did not fart in her husband's lap. I will give you a moment to sit with that. The oldest written joke in human history, from nearly 4,000 years ago, is a fart joke. This tells us something important. Not just that people have always found bodily functions amusing, which is reassuring in its own way, but that there is something fundamental in what makes human beings laugh. Some core of shared perception about incongruity and embarrassment, and the gap between dignity and reality that transcends culture and time and language. The Sumerians would have found some of our humor baffling, but some of it they would have understood immediately. Let's talk about Sumerian music, because the Sumerians were devoted musicians, and the musical tradition of their civilization was rich and sophisticated. We know this partly from texts. There are Sumerian hymns that specify the instruments to be used in their performance, and the mode or tuning system to be employed. There are references to many different types of instruments, harps and lyres and lutes, drums of various sizes, reed flutes and pipes, percussion instruments. Music was an integral part of religious ritual, and the gods were believed to love music in much the way they loved food and fine clothing. But we also know it from physical evidence. The lyres found in the royal tombs of Ur are among the most spectacular artifacts of the ancient world. They are not primitive instruments. They are beautifully constructed, with the tuning pegs of a modern harp, with resonating chambers that suggest an understanding of acoustics, with decoration of extraordinary artistry. And in recent decades, musicologists have made a remarkable discovery. There is a Sumerian tablet that contains what appears to be a musical notation, a system of marks that specify the tuning and the notes of a particular piece of music. The tablet dates to around 1400 BCE, from the later Babylonian period, but the notation system it uses appears to be Sumerian in origin and may be much older. Scholars have attempted to reconstruct the music from this notation. There are recordings you can find, careful scholarly attempts to bring back a musical tradition that was lost for 3,000 years. They sound strange to ears accustomed to Western music, using scales and intervals that we are not familiar with. But there is something in them, something that feels recognizably musical, that makes you understand that the people who played these instruments were not so different from the musicians of any other time. The harp in the royal tomb of Ur has the head of a bull, made from gold foil over a wooden core, with a beard of lapis lazuli. When it was found, the wood had rotted away entirely, leaving only the gold and lapis and the silver tuning pegs in the soil in the shape of the original instrument. Woolley and his team carefully poured plaster around the remaining components to hold them in place while the soil was removed, preserving the shape. Imagine, the last time that harp was played was around 2500 BCE. Imagine sitting in the court of a Sumerian king and hearing it, the sound of its strings in that flat, hot land, in a great hall lit by oil lamps, the smoke of incense in the air, the court assembled in its fine robes and jewelry. The music has been gone for 4,500 years, but the harp is still there. Something that gets less attention in popular accounts of Sumerian civilization is the role of women, which was more complex and in some respects more equal than you might expect for a society of this age. Let's start with what we know for certain. Women in ancient Sumer could own property. They could conduct business, buy and sell goods, make contracts. There are tablets documenting women as active economic participants, running shops, managing estates, engaging in long-distance trade. Women could be priestesses, and in some periods, the most important religious roles in major temples were held by women. The priestess of the moon god at Ur, a position that Sargon's daughter, Enheduanna, occupied and made famous, was one of the highest status roles in all of Mesopotamia. The En was understood as the earthly spouse of the deity, and she lived within the temple precinct and participated in the most sacred rituals. Women in Sumer could appear in court. They could testify. They could bring lawsuits. The law codes of Sumer contain provisions that specifically address the rights of women in marriage, divorce, and inheritance. and while those provisions are not equal to what we would consider fair today, they are notably more protective of women's interests than many later legal traditions. There were female scribes. Not many, because the scribal profession was dominated by men, but the existence of female scribes at all in 2500 BCE is remarkable. There were women who ran their own businesses independently. We have records of female brewers, female merchants, female weavers who sold their goods on their own account rather than through male intermediaries. The weaving industry, which was one of the most economically important industries in ancient Sumer, employed enormous numbers of women. The temple weaving workshops of the Ur-3 period, the ones that produced so much of the cloth that fueled the empire's economy, were staffed primarily by women and children. The conditions in these workshops were not, by modern standards, good. The workers received fixed rations and had limited freedom of movement. But they were paid, after a fashion, and they were part of the formal economic structure of the state. The position of women in Sumer deteriorated over time. The law codes of the Babylonian period, which succeed those of Sumer, place increasingly strict restrictions on women's behavior and public activity. The rights to own property and conduct business independently, while never entirely eliminated, became more circumscribed. But in the earliest period, in the Sumerian city-states of the early dynastic era, the picture is of a society where women's economic participation was not just tolerated, but actively incorporated into the functioning of the city. And then there is Inanna. I have mentioned Inanna before, but she deserves more than a passing reference, because she is one of the most extraordinary figures in the entire history of religion and mythology, and the stories told about her in Sumer are unlike anything in the later traditions that most modern readers are familiar with. Inanna was not a gentle goddess of love in the way that Aphrodite can sometimes seem gentle. She was a storm. She was desire and war, and the terrifying power of female sexuality unleashed. She took what she wanted. She discarded what no longer interested her. She descended into the underworld and faced its queen and was killed, and then she came back. The hymns to Inanna, written by Enheduanna, are among the most passionate pieces of ancient literature. Enheduanna addressed the goddess directly, sometimes with awe, sometimes with something that comes very close to reproach. In the hymn to Inanna, there are lines that vibrate with a kind of raw emotional honesty that feels startlingly modern. At your battle cry, my lady, the foreign lands bow low. When humanity comes before you in awed silence at the terrifying radiance and tempest, you grasp the most terrible of all the divine powers. This is not the language of comfortable piety. This is the language of someone who has truly encountered something overwhelming and is trying to find words for an experience that exceeds the capacity of ordinary language. Inanna appears in the myths as a goddess who never quite stays within the role assigned to her. She wants more than she is given. She asks the older god Enki for the divine powers, the me, which are the fundamental principles of civilization. Everything from kingship and priesthood to the craft of the blacksmith and the skill of the scribe. Enki gives them to her freely, and then, when she is gone, he regrets it and sends demons to take them back. But Inanna has already brought them to her city, Uruk, and refuses to give them up. The me are an interesting concept. They are not just skills or abilities. They are the fundamental organizing principles of civilized life. The list of me includes lordship, kingship, the function of priests and priestesses, descent to the underworld and ascent from it, the art of song, the craft of smithing, the ability to deceive, the ability to be truthful, the function of scribes, the art of the carpenter, the art of the weaver, the art of the leather worker, the art of the metal worker, the art of the builder of reed structures, and many more. Inanna claims all of them and carries them to Uruk. This is the myth that explains why Uruk became the greatest city of its age, why it had the most sophisticated culture and the most advanced technology and the most skilled craftsmen. Because Inanna brought the principles of those things to it, wresting them from Enki's city by a combination of charm and cunning and sheer determination. There is something in this myth that speaks to the way the Sumerians understood the relationship between specific places and specific knowledge. The best city is the city that has attracted the attention of the most powerful deity. The best craftsmen are the craftsmen whose patron god has bestowed divine knowledge on their craft. Technology and culture are not just human achievements, they are divine gifts, flowing through specific channels to specific people. But Inanna earned those gifts. She didn't just receive them, she asked for them, and when Enki tried to take them back, she refused. That combination of divine authority and personal agency is part of what makes her such a compelling figure. Mathematics. The Sumerians developed one of the most sophisticated mathematical traditions of the ancient world, and the traces of that tradition are embedded so deeply in our daily lives that most of us have no idea they came from ancient Mesopotamia. Consider the number 60. Why do we divide the hour into 60 minutes and the minute into 60 seconds? Why does a circle contain 360 degrees? Why does a minute of arc contain 60 seconds of arc? Because the Sumerians used a base 60 number system. We use base 10, the decimal system, probably because we have 10 fingers. The Sumerians used base 60, which is a remarkable choice because 60 has more factors than any smaller number, being divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, and 60. This makes it extremely convenient for division and for working with fractions, because many common fractions come out to whole numbers in base 60. The Sumerian mathematical tablets contain multiplication tables, reciprocal tables, tables of squares and square roots, and cube roots. They contain problems and solutions involving geometry, calculating the areas of fields and the volumes of granaries. They contain what appear to be the earliest examples of algebraic thinking in human history. Problems involving unknowns that must be solved. One type of problem that appears repeatedly in Sumerian mathematical tablets is the digging problem. If you need to dig a canal of a certain length and depth, how many workers do you need? And how much will you pay them in rations? And how long will it take? These are practical problems that arose directly from the need to manage the great canal building projects that made Sumerian agriculture possible. But there are also problems that seem to be purely theoretical, problems with no obvious practical application that appear to be exercises in mathematical thinking for its own sake. This is a remarkable thing to find in a culture that is sometimes characterized as purely practical. The Sumerians, it seems, took a genuine intellectual pleasure in mathematics that went beyond what the needs of administration required. The Babylonians, who inherited the Sumerian mathematical tradition, extended it considerably. The Babylonian mathematical tablets include problems that come very close to the Pythagorean theorem, more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras. They include problems that appear to involve what we would now call quadratic equations. Whether the Babylonians knew they were doing algebra in the abstract sense, or whether they understood it as a collection of specific problem-solving techniques, is debated among historians of mathematics. But the tradition began in Sumer. The base 60 system began in Sumer. The meticulous record-keeping that made mathematical progress possible began in Sumer. When you check the time on your phone tonight and see the minutes and the seconds, you are using a system that was invented in a mud brick city on the banks of the Euphrates 5,000 years ago. Let me take you now into the later years of Sumer's story, the long twilight that followed the collapse of the third dynasty of Ur and the slow dissolution of distinctly Sumerian culture into the broader Mesopotamian world. This was not a sudden disappearance. The Sumerian language continued to be used in religious and literary contexts for centuries after it ceased to be spoken as anyone's native tongue. The great myths continued to be copied and studied. The theological framework that the Sumerians had built continued to shape how Mesopotamians understood the world, even as the specific names of gods and the specific forms of worship shifted under Babylonian and later Assyrian influence. Think of it this way. When the Roman Empire fell in the West, Latin did not immediately disappear. It survived for 1,000 years as the language of the church, of scholarship, of law. People who could not speak a word of Latin in ordinary life learned it because the texts that mattered were written in it. The knowledge and the culture that had been expressed in Latin continued to exert enormous influence on everything that came after, even as the living language died. The Sumerian language had a similar afterlife. It became a sacred language, a prestige language, the language of the oldest and most important texts. Babylonian scribes, who spoke Akkadian as their native tongue, spent years studying Sumerian so they could read and copy the great literary works. They compiled dictionaries, Sumerian-Akkadian bilingual texts that helped later readers navigate the older language. This means that when archaeologists found those cuneiform tablets in the ruins of Nineveh in the 19th century, they found not just Assyrian texts, but copies of Sumerian originals, preserved because the later civilization that found them recognized their value and went to considerable trouble to keep them. Civilization, when it is working well, does this. It preserves what came before, even when what came before is old and strange and speaks in a language no one now uses. It recognizes that the past is not dead weight but foundation, and that to throw away the foundation is to risk the entire structure collapsing. The Sumerians understood this. Their scribes copied the oldest texts they could find. Their temples maintained rituals that were already ancient in their own time. Their language of religion was older than the language of daily life, and so the tradition was carried forward. In the centuries between the fall of Ur III around 2004 BCE and the rise of Babylon's first dynasty around 1894 BCE, the political landscape of Mesopotamia was fragmented and unstable, but the cities continued. The temples continued. The scribal schools continued. It is in this period, the Essene-Larsa period, that some of the most interesting developments in Sumerian literature occurred. The great literary texts that were already old were compiled and organized. Versions were compared and standardized, and the tradition of what a properly educated person should know was formalized. It is also in this period that the Sumerian laments were composed, or at least written down in their final forms. These laments, for the destruction of Ur, for the destruction of Nippur, for the destruction of Sumer and Akkad, are some of the most emotionally powerful texts from the ancient world. The lament for the destruction of Sumer and Akkad is particularly affecting because it does not just mourn the fall of one city, but the fall of an entire civilization. The goddess Ningal, consort of the moon god Nana and divine patron of Ur, pleads with the great gods not to destroy her city. She prostrates herself, she argues her case, she begs for mercy, and the gods decline to listen. This is a theme in Sumerian literature that I find deeply moving. The gods make decisions, and those decisions have terrible consequences for human beings, and the human beings, and even the lower gods who care about those human beings, cannot stop it. The great cosmic machinery operates according to its own logic, and individual suffering, however real and however painful, is simply not of ultimate concern to the forces that determine history. But the act of writing the lament, of giving the suffering a voice, of insisting that it be recorded and remembered, is itself a form of resistance. Not resistance that can change what happened, but resistance against forgetting, against the erasure of the specific and the human in the face of the vast and the impersonal. These laments were probably used in actual religious rituals, performed at the rebuilt temples of the destroyed cities, giving communities a formal structure in which to mourn what had been lost and renew their commitment to what remained. They served the same function that funeral rites serve in any culture. They made the loss real, they gave it shape, and by giving it shape, they made it bearable. We still do this. We still need to give our losses shape. We still need to say the name of what we have lost, to weep for it in words, to write it down. The laments of ancient Sumer and the elegies of modern poetry come from the same deep human need. One more story, before I bring you toward the end of this long journey. There is a Sumerian tale, probably from the Ur III period, or slightly earlier, called The Descent of Inanna to the Underworld in its fullest form. I mentioned it earlier, but I want to go back to it now with more attention, because it is one of the most psychologically rich pieces of literature from the ancient world. Inanna decides, for reasons that the text does not fully explain, to visit her sister Ereshkigal in the underworld. She dresses in her finest, adorning herself with all 7 of her divine attributes: the crown of the steppe on her head, the measuring rod in her hand, the pectoral of small lapis lazuli beads on her chest, the golden ring on her hand, the breastplate called Come Man, Come on her breast, the golden clasps on her hands and feet, the royal robe draped around her body. She is, at the moment of her descent, the most powerful entity in the cosmos. She is fully herself, fully in her power, fully adorned with everything that makes her who she is. But there are 7 gates to the underworld, and at each gate, a gatekeeper demands the removal of one of her attributes. Inanna asks why. The gatekeeper tells her, "The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned." At the first gate, her crown is removed. At the second gate, her pectoral of lapis lazuli. At the third gate, her measuring rod. At the fourth gate, her golden ring. At the fifth gate, the breastplate. At the sixth gate, her clasps. At the seventh gate, the royal robe. And Inanna descends naked into the presence of Ereshkigal, completely stripped, nothing of her power and dignity remaining. Everything that defined her, taken away, one piece at a time. And Ereshkigal kills her and hangs her body on a hook. Now, there are many ways to read this myth. The straightforward mythological reading is that it explains the origin of the seasons, the descent into darkness followed by the return to light. There is a descent and there is an ascent, as there is in all cyclical nature myths. But psychologists have noted that this myth describes something else as well, something about the process of transformation and renewal that requires the stripping away of all identities, all roles, all the things we use to tell ourselves and others who we are. To become something new, you sometimes have to pass through a space where you are nothing, where all your crowns and your measuring rods and your breastplates are taken from you at the door, and you stand naked in the dark, and there is no way to impress anyone with who you used to be. Inanna goes to the underworld voluntarily. She chooses to go. She tells her servant Ninshubur that if she does not return in 3 days to seek help from the gods above, she makes arrangements. She plans for the possibility of failure, and then she goes through the gates, losing herself piece by piece, and dies, and is brought back, eventually, through the efforts of her faithful servant and the cleverness of the god Enki, and returns to the world changed. The text does not explicitly say that Inanna is changed by her experience. The myth is more interested in the plot mechanics of her rescue and her subsequent rage at Dumuzi, but the structure of the story implies transformation. The figure who descends is not quite the same as the figure who ascends. This is the oldest descent narrative in human history. The structure of descent, death, and return appears again in the myths of Osiris and Dionysus, in the harrowing of hell in Christian tradition, in countless stories from cultures around the world. But here it is first, in a Sumerian clay tablet, the story of a goddess who chose to walk into the dark and paid a price for it and came back. The last great flowering of Sumerian literary tradition occurs in the court of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, and particularly during the reign of Shulgi, that extravagant self-promoter who may have genuinely been one of the most remarkable rulers of the ancient world. Shulgi appears to have been personally invested in the literary tradition of Sumer in a way that few rulers before or after him matched. His court supported a circle of composers and scribes who created new hymns and songs in his honor, but who also worked to organize and preserve the older tradition. Under Shulgi's patronage, the scribal schools of Nippur, which were the most prestigious in Mesopotamia, became centers of literary production. The students at these schools copied older texts, creating the manuscript tradition that would preserve so much of Sumerian literature for us. They also composed new texts, in Shulgi's honor and in the honor of the gods, working within the established conventions of Sumerian literature, but adding their own contributions. The literary texts from this period are extraordinary in their variety and sophistication. There are royal hymns of great formal beauty. There are mythological texts that explore the relationships between the gods with psychological complexity. There are wisdom texts that offer practical advice about everything from farming to legal disputes. There are love songs of startling tenderness. One of the most famous love songs associated with the Ur-3 period is sometimes called the Love Song of Shu-Sin, because it seems to have been written for or about a specific king of that name. It is addressed from a woman to her king, and it is unambiguous in its content. Bridegroom, dear to my heart, goodly is your beauty, honey sweet. Lion, dear to my heart, goodly is your beauty, honey sweet. You have captivated me. Let me stand tremblingly before you. bridegroom, I would be taken by you to the bedchamber. This is a human voice, across 4,000 years, expressing something as immediate and recognizable as anything you might find in a modern poem. Desire, tenderness, the trembling of being in the presence of someone who overwhelms you. The Sumerians felt that. They wrote it down, they preserved it, and here we are, reading it, feeling something that connects us to a person who pressed these words into clay in a city that no longer exists, in a language no one now speaks, thousands of years before the language of this sentence was a glimmer in the future. Time collapses in moments like these. The distance seems to dissolve. The salinization of the soil in southern Mesopotamia is something I mentioned earlier, but it deserves more attention because it is one of the most important and least discussed factors in the decline of Sumerian civilization. The problem is this: when you irrigate land that does not have adequate natural drainage, the water soaks into the soil and brings with it dissolved salts from the groundwater. As the water evaporates in the dry air, those salts are left behind, depositing in the upper layers of the soil. Over many years and decades, the salt content of the soil builds up to the point where it interferes with plant growth. The most salt-tolerant crops, like barley, can still grow, but less tolerant crops, like wheat, begin to fail. Eventually, if nothing is done, even barley cannot grow. We can trace this process in the archaeological record of Sumer with remarkable precision, because the Sumerians kept records of their crop yields. In the early period, the records show that wheat and barley were both grown in roughly equal proportions. By around 2500 BCE, wheat had almost entirely disappeared from the records of the southern cities. By 2000 BCE, barley yields in some areas were declining as well. This is not the only factor in the decline of Sumerian civilization. The political disruptions were real. The military pressures from the Amorites and the Elamites were real. The shifting of trade routes was real, but the slow degradation of the agricultural base that had supported everything, that is something that no military victory could fix and no administrative reform could address. The land was becoming less productive, and a civilization that cannot feed itself is a civilization in fundamental trouble. Some scholars have argued that the abandonment of certain cities and the southward shift of population in the Earth III period and after can be traced partly to the search for land that was not yet too salty to farm. The Sumerians moved around within their own landscape, trying to stay ahead of a problem they may not have fully understood. They never found a solution to it. The solution would have required an understanding of soil chemistry that was millennia in the future. They did what they could, which was to select for salt-tolerant crops and to periodically let fields lie fallow, but these measures only slowed the process. The land that had made Sumerian civilization possible was slowly turning against it, and there was nothing the most brilliant administrators, the most powerful kings, the most devoted priests could do about it. This is a hard truth about civilizations. Sometimes they fail not because of moral weakness or military defeat or political incompetence, but because the physical world they depend on changes in ways they cannot manage. The Sumerians did not fail because they stopped trying. They failed, in part, because the ground beneath their feet stopped working. That is a kind of tragedy that feels especially relevant to our own moment in history, as we grapple with changes in our own physical world that threaten the foundations of what we have built. The Sumerians could not have imagined us, any more than we can truly imagine them, but the shape of their problem, the question of what you do when the world you have built begins to change in ways you cannot control, is a question that connects us to them across all the distance of time. Let the night grow quieter now. Let the images of Sumer drift and settle like the silt of the Euphrates, slowly coming to rest on the bottom of a slow-moving river. The wedge-shaped marks in the clay, the ziggurat against the enormous sky, the golden harp with its lapis lazuli beard, the schoolboy who was late and got beaten, the priestess performing the evening rites by lamplight, the farmer walking home along the canal, watching the stars appear in the water at his feet, the laments, the love songs, the riddles, the fart joke, the flood story, and the descent into the underworld, and the king who ran 160 miles in a day, and the woman who wrote hymns that are still read after 4,000 years. All of it happened. All of it was real. All of it was lived by people who were, in the ways that matter most, recognizably like you and me. They got tired. They got hungry. They fell in love. They had debts they couldn't pay. They made plans that didn't work out. They told their children stories at bedtime. They looked up at the sky and felt small. And they built something that had never existed before and that changed the world forever. The story of Sumer does not have a clean ending, because civilizations do not end cleanly. They dissolve, they transform, they are absorbed. They leave traces that persist long after the names are forgotten. What ended in Sumer was eventually replaced by Babylon, and Babylon was eventually replaced by Assyria, and Assyria was eventually replaced by the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and the Neo-Babylonian Empire was replaced by Persia, and Persia was replaced by Alexander, and from Alexander came the Hellenistic world that shaped the Rome, that shaped the Europe, that shaped the world you live in. At every step, something was carried forward. Some knowledge, some story, some idea, some practice. The 60-second minute and the 12-month year, and the zodiac and the legal concept of contracts, and the idea that the powerful have obligations to the weak, and the story of a great flood, and the knowledge of how to make beer, and the practice of writing things down so they will not be forgotten. These things have been with us so long that we have forgotten where they came from. We have forgotten that there was a first time, a moment when someone first pressed a stylus into clay and made a mark that meant something, when someone first looked at the rising waters and said, "We need to build a wall here," when someone first looked at the night sky and started mapping the movements of the stars. But it happened. It all happened. And it happened in Sumer, on the flat plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in cities of mud brick under an enormous sky, by people whose names are preserved in clay tablets in the museums of the world, waiting for us to read them. Tonight you have traveled back 5,000 years and more. You have stood in the marshes where it all began. You have watched the cities rise and the ziggurats take shape against the sky. You have sat in the scribal school and pressed your stylus into clay. You have drunk thick beer through a reed straw in the marketplace of You have listened to the hymns of Enheduanna and the love songs of the Three Court and the lament that someone wrote when the city fell. You have met Gilgamesh, who was 2/3 divine and could not accept death, and you have understood perhaps why that story is still told. Because none of us can fully accept death, and all of us are looking for something that will last beyond us, something we can press our hands against and say, "Here, I was here, I built this." The walls of Uruk are dust now. The ziggurat of Ur is a worn stump of brick rising from the desert. The great canals are dry. The cities are mounds. But the tablets endure. The words endure. And tonight, in the quiet of wherever you are resting, the words have reached you and you have carried them in your mind. And now they are part of you, part of the long chain of human memory that stretches back through time to that flat plain under the enormous sky where it all began. That is not nothing. That is everything. Sleep now. Let it all settle. Let the rivers flow and the stars turn, and the silt settle slowly to the bottom of the great slow river. The Sumerians are here, in the bones of the world you live in, and they are at rest, and you can be at rest too. Good night. There is one more thing I want to give you before this night is over. One more glimpse into the world of the Sumerians that I think will stay with you. It is not dramatic. It is not about kings or gods or great battles. It is about bread. The Sumerians baked bread. Extraordinary amounts of it, in extraordinary varieties. We know this because they wrote about it in meticulous detail, as they wrote about almost everything. There are texts listing dozens of different types of bread, distinguished by the grain used, the method of preparation, the shape, the additions of fat or oil or sesame or dates or garlic or honey. There was bread baked in a clay oven, bread baked directly on the embers of a fire, bread steamed in a sealed vessel, bread pressed flat and dried until it was crisp enough to last for weeks, bread that was soft and thick and fragrant with sesame, bread that was made with emmer wheat, which was already an ancient grain in Sumer's time, bread that was made with barley, which was more reliable in the salty soil of the southern plain. The act of baking bread was understood as a sacred act. Nippur, the goddess of grain and writing, and the scribal arts, presided over the transformation of grain into something nourishing. The bread that was offered in the temples was among the most important of all offerings. The gods ate bread and drank beer, and so did their servants, the human beings who lived in the god's city. I think about this sometimes. The continuity of it, the profound, unbroken line of human beings who have made bread from grain, who have smelled that particular smell of dough in an oven, who have broken a loaf and shared it and felt the simple pleasure of eating something that they made. That line runs back to the Sumerians and beyond. It runs back to the very beginning of agriculture, 10,000 years ago, to the first people who noticed that the grasses they had been gathering produced better results. If you put the seeds deliberately in the ground and watched over them and came back to harvest them. We are at the end of a line that long. Every meal you have ever eaten is connected to that first deliberate planting, to those first harvests, to those first bakings in clay ovens in villages that would become the cities that would become civilization. The smell of fresh bread is 5,000 years old, 10,000 years old. It is the smell of the decision that made everything else possible. Water. Everything in Sumer comes back to water. The civilization was built on the management of water, the control of the floods, and the direction of the flow, and the storage of the surplus, and the distribution of the scarcity. The canals of ancient Sumer were not just irrigation channels, they were highways. The boats that moved along them carried not just agricultural products but people, news, ideas. A message sent by boat along the canal network could reach another city within days. Goods that would take weeks to transport by donkey caravan could move along the river network in a fraction of the time. This connectivity is one of the things that made the Sumerian city-states more than just isolated settlements. They were connected nodes in a network, in continuous communication, in continuous exchange. Ideas moved along that network almost as freely as goods. A new temple design developed in one city was known in others within a generation. A new administrative technique, a new mathematical approach, a new type of poetry spread along the canals and the rivers to the whole civilization. The water, in other words, was not just the physical foundation of Sumerian agriculture, it was the medium through which Sumerian culture spread and developed and became a coherent thing rather than a collection of unrelated experiments. And the maintenance of that water system was a collective responsibility, not one city's problem but everyone's problem. If the canal from the river to your city's fields was blocked or damaged upstream by another city's actions, your people would suffer. This mutual dependence, this shared stake in the functioning of the water system, was one of the things that bound the city-states of Sumer to each other, even in periods of conflict. They could fight each other over the direction of a canal's flow, but they could not afford to let the whole system collapse. This enforced interdependence is one of the early lessons of civilization, that you cannot fully prosper if your neighbors are completely failing, that the shared infrastructure on which everyone depends must be maintained by everyone. That pure competition without any cooperation leads not to the victory of the strong, but to the collapse of the whole system. The Sumerians learned this through long experience. They encoded it in their laws and their administrative systems and their religious obligations. The temples that coordinated the labor of canal maintenance were not just religious institutions, they were also the mechanisms through which the shared infrastructure of the civilization was maintained. Every canal was a prayer. Every irrigation channel was an act of faith that the community would hold together long enough for the water to do its work and the harvest to come in and the city to survive another year. Let the water flow now, in your mind, in the quiet darkness. The canal at the edge of the field, catching the moonlight. The slow movement of a flat-bottomed boat, heavily laden, moving through the dark water toward the city. The sound of the reeds along the bank, brushing against each other in the night wind. Somewhere, a night bird calls. Somewhere, a fire is burning low, the last embers of an evening's warmth, and someone is lying near it, not quite asleep, looking at the stars. The stars have not changed. They are still there. The same stars that the Sumerian farmers watched. The same stars that the Baru priests recorded in their meticulous tablets. The same stars that the poets invoked when they wrote hymns to the moon god Nana, who sailed across the sky in his great boat every night, lighting the darkness, marking the months. Nana in his boat, the moon on the water, the slow turning of the night. This is what it felt like on the flat plain between the rivers 6,000 years ago. Not so different from what it feels like to lie in the dark tonight, listening to the sounds of the world beyond your window, watching the slow movement of light and shadow as the moon moves across the sky. We are not so different. We are not so far. The Sumerian scribes, who copied the great texts in the scribal schools of Nippur, were doing something that they probably thought of as routine work. Copying was the primary activity of a scribe's education. You copied until you had the text in your hands and in your body, as well as in your mind. You copied until you could write it without thinking about the signs, until the signs had become automatic, until what you were doing was not decoding a symbol system, but reading with your whole body. But in doing that work, those scribes were making a choice, even if they did not think of it as a choice. They were choosing to carry those texts forward. They were choosing to spend their labor, hour after hour, preserving the words of people who had been dead for generations. They preserved the Epic of Gilgamesh. They preserved the descent of Inanna. They preserved the lament for the destruction of They preserved the instructions of Shuruppak with their practical wisdom about donkeys and debt. They preserved the love songs and the debate poems and the hymns to the gods. And because they did that work, we have those texts now. Because they chose, every day, to go to school and sit down at the wooden bench and take up the stylus and press the signs into the clay, we can read those words tonight. The chain of transmission is long and fragile and remarkable. From the original composition to the clay tablets in the Library of Nineveh, to the excavation of those tablets in the 1840s, to the patient work of scholars who learned to read the signs, to the translations that put those texts into modern languages, to the people who wrote books about them, to the possibility of knowing, tonight, what Enheduanna felt when she was driven from her temple, and what the student felt when he got beaten for being late to school. A chain that long, that fragile, that improbably intact. And here we are, at the end of it, receiving what those scribes sent forward without knowing where it would land. They gave us a gift. They gave us the words. And the best way to honor that gift is to hold it gently, to pass it on, to let the chain continue. You are almost asleep now. I can feel it in the rhythm of this night. The way the words have been getting slower, and the images gentler, and the distance between one thought and the next a little wider. That is good. That is exactly right. Let the great flat plain of ancient Sumer spread out in your mind, enormous and golden and somehow peaceful. The kind of peace that comes from having seen a lot and understood a little, and accepted that there is so much more to know than any single life could hold. Let the rivers run. Let the cities hum with their ancient life. Let the scribes copy and the priests chant, and the farmers walk home along the canals, and the children fall asleep to stories of Gilgamesh and his friend who died, and the wall he built that still stands in the story, even if it is dust in the ground. Let it all be real, as it was real. Let it have mattered, as it mattered. Let those lives have been lived, as they were lived, fully and with purpose, and with the same mixture of joy and grief and worry and love that makes any life a life. The Sumerians were here. They were the first, and they gave us everything. Now sleep. The ancient world is resting. The rivers flow to the sea, and you are held, gently, at the end of a very long story. In the dark of this particular night, in this particular place, in the long continued miracle of a civilization that started in the mud between two rivers and has not stopped yet. Good night. Sleep well. We have not yet talked about death, about what the Sumerians believed happened to you after your life was over, what waited on the other side of the moment when your heart stopped and your breath stopped and the world you had known became a world you were no longer part of. The Sumerian understanding of death was not comforting. There was no paradise waiting for the righteous. There was no eternal life of joy and light. There was only the underworld, a place called the Land of No Return, which tells you everything you need to know about how the Sumerians regarded it. The underworld in Sumerian belief was called the Kur, a word that also meant mountain or foreign land, which suggests something about how the Sumerians conceived of death, as a journey to a place utterly unlike the world they knew, a journey from which no traveller came back. The underworld was ruled by Ereshkigal, whose name means Queen of the Great Earth, and it was a place of dust and darkness. The dead in the underworld lived in conditions that mirrored, in diminished form, their lives in the world above. A person who had been given a proper burial and who had descendants to make offerings on their behalf would be reasonably comfortable. A person who had died violently, without burial, without anyone to remember them, would suffer a particularly grim existence. This belief had practical consequences. Burying the dead properly was not just a matter of sentiment, it was a genuine act of care for the person who had died, because the quality of their existence in the afterlife depended on it. And making regular offerings at the grave or at the temple in memory of the dead was equally important. If you had no descendants to remember you, your afterlife would be genuinely terrible. This gave people a very concrete reason to have children and to maintain family connections across generations. The dead depended on the living. The living owed a debt to the dead. The relationship between the generations extended beyond death. There is something almost beautiful in that idea, even though the vision of the afterlife that motivates it is bleak. The dead are not gone. They are still present, still in need, still connected to the world of the living through the thread of memory and offering. To forget someone who has died is to do them real harm. To remember them is to give them something they genuinely need. We no longer believe what the Sumerians believed about the mechanics of death and the afterlife, but the feeling that forgetting is a kind of harm, that remembering is a kind of care, that the dead deserve to be acknowledged and honored, that we still have. That has not gone anywhere. The funeral practices of ancient Sumer, particularly in the early dynastic period, reveal a society with a detailed and well-developed set of beliefs about what was owed to the dead and how those debts should be paid. Ordinary people were buried beneath the floors of their houses. This was not grim or unsanitary by the standards of the time. It kept the dead close, within the family home, where the living could maintain their connection to them easily. Offerings could be made through a pipe left in the burial, through which libations of water and oil and beer could be poured directly to the dead below. The wealthy were buried in tombs, stone-built structures in the city's cemetery area, with goods commensurate with their status. The goods were not just for decoration, they were for use. The dead person, continuing a diminished version of their life in the underworld, would need the same things they had needed in the world above: tools, food, drink, weapons for warriors, jewelry and clothing for those who had worn such things in life. The great death pits of the royal cemetery at Ur, which I described earlier, represent an extreme version of this logic. If the king continued a royal existence in the underworld, he would need his court, and so his court accompanied him. We recoil from this. Rightly so. The people who died in those pits had not, as far as we can tell, committed any crime. They were servants, musicians, soldiers, attendants. The logic that ended their lives was the logic that the king's need for companions in death outweighed their right to continue living. And yet, the fact that they were buried in their finest clothing, with valuable objects, with musical instruments, tells us that whoever arranged those burials did not think of these people as worthless. They were being sent on the same journey as their royal master. They were being given what they would need for that journey. It was murder, certainly, from our perspective, but it was murder committed by people who believed, genuinely, that what they were doing was necessary and that it conferred some kind of dignity on the dead. This is one of the harder truths of studying ancient civilizations. The people who did things we find monstrous were not monsters. They were human beings acting within a framework of belief that gave their actions meaning. Understanding that does not require us to approve of what they did, but it does require us to engage with it honestly, rather than simply dismissing ancient peoples as primitively cruel. The Sumerians were not more cruel than we are. They were differently cruel. They did things we would not do, because their beliefs led them in different directions. But we do things, our civilization does things, that future generations may look back on with equal or greater horror. That is not a comfortable thought, but it is an honest one. Let me take you into the Sumerian marketplace one more time, because I want to give you a sense of just how connected ancient Sumer was to the wider world. We sometimes imagine ancient civilizations as isolated, as if each one developed entirely on its own, unaware of the others, exchanging nothing but the occasional war. This is not what the evidence shows. The Sumerians were active traders across an enormous area, and the evidence for their trade connections is embedded in the physical objects found at their sites. Lapis lazuli, that deep celestial blue that appears everywhere in Sumerian art and jewelry, comes exclusively from the Badakhshan region of northeastern Afghanistan. Every piece of lapis lazuli in every museum in the world that came from ancient Mesopotamia traveled 3,000 miles to get there. Carnelian, the deep red-orange stone, came from Gujarat in northwestern India. The gold came from Anatolia or from East Africa. The cedar logs used in temple construction came from the mountains of Lebanon, floated down the Euphrates on rafts. The diorite used for the finest statues came from Oman, and in the other direction, Sumerian products traveled out across the world. Woolen textiles from Mesopotamia have been found in Central Asia. Sumerian-style cylinder seals have been found in Egypt and in the Indus Valley. The influence of Mesopotamian artistic styles can be traced through the ancient Near East. All of this trade required organization. It required merchants who knew multiple languages, who could navigate the roads and the rivers and the sea lanes, who could make contracts that would be honored in distant cities by people they had never met. The merchants of ancient Sumer were sophisticated operators. Some of them were independent entrepreneurs. Others were agents of the temple or the palace, conducting trade on behalf of the institutional powers that had provided them with the capital goods to trade in the first place. The institution of the Tamkaram, the professional merchant, appears early in Sumerian history and continues through the Babylonian period. These were specialists, men and sometimes women who had the skills and the connections to operate across large distances, dealing in high-value goods where the risks were significant but the profits could be enormous. They traveled by boat on the rivers and canals of Mesopotamia, which were the great highways of the ancient Near East. They traveled by donkey caravan across the highlands of Anatolia and the plateaus of Iran. They traveled by ship along the Persian Gulf Coast, calling at ports that served as nodes in a trading network connecting Mesopotamia, the Arabian Peninsula, the coasts of India, and East Africa. We know about these merchants partly from their letters. Hundreds of letters from the Old Assyrian period, just slightly later than the height of Sumerian civilization, have been found at the ancient trading colony of Kanesh in central Anatolia. These letters are written in cuneiform on small clay tablets and sealed in clay envelopes. They are letters between merchants and their families, between business partners, between agents in the field and their employers back in Assur. They read, in many ways, exactly like business correspondence today. There are complaints about delayed shipments. There are disputes about quality and price. There are requests for updates on market conditions. There are instructions for specific transactions. There are expressions of frustration and urgency and relief. One of the most affecting things about these letters is the glimpses they give of the human beings behind the commercial activity. A merchant writes to his wife, asking how she is doing and whether the children are well. A woman writes to her brother, asking him to stop making risky investments with her money. A son writes to his father, explaining why a particular business deal went wrong and why it is not entirely his fault. 5,000 years ago, a son explaining to his father why the business deal went wrong. Not entirely his fault. The Sumerian city of Nippur occupies a special place in the history of the civilization because it was not primarily a political capital or a military power, but a religious and cultural center. Nippur was the city of Enlil, the chief of the gods, and it was understood as the spiritual heart of Sumer even when other cities held political supremacy. Because of this status, Nippur was remarkably stable. While cities rose and fell, while kings conquered and were conquered, Nippur maintained its religious function and was respected by all parties. Even foreign rulers who had conquered the rest of Mesopotamia typically left Nippur's temples intact and maintained their offerings to Enlil, because to be accepted as legitimate rulers of Sumer, you had to have the blessing of the god at Nippur. The scribal schools at Nippur were the most prestigious in Mesopotamia. Students came from across the region to study there. The curriculum was demanding: years of studying cuneiform signs, copying standard texts, learning the mathematical tables, memorizing the hymns and myths that formed the core of educated Sumerian culture. We know a great deal about the Nippur scribal tradition because enormous numbers of school tablets have been found there, including the exercise tablets of students in the process of learning. These tablets show the student writing a line, then the teacher's correction underneath, then the student's attempt at the corrected version. The relationship between teacher and student was formalized. The teacher was called the father of the school, and the student was called the son of the school. The advanced students, called big brothers, helped to teach the younger students. It was a hierarchical system with clear roles and expectations. The punishments for poor work or misbehavior were physical. Caning was the standard disciplinary tool. The texts are frank about this. They describe the cane being applied for arriving late, for talking out of turn, for poor quality work, for not having learned the previous day's lesson adequately. But the schools also provided an extraordinary education. A student who completed the full curriculum at Nippur would be deeply versed in Sumerian literature, mythology, mathematics, and legal procedure. They would be capable of writing in multiple genres, from simple receipts to complex hymns. They would be employable in the most demanding administrative positions in the temple or palace, and they would have absorbed, through years of copying ancient texts, a deep familiarity with the literary tradition of Sumer. They would know the Epic of Gilgamesh. They would know the myths of Inanna. They would know the laments and the hymns and the wisdom texts and the debate poems. They would be, in the fullest sense of the word, educated. Not just trained, but cultivated. Formed by their encounter with the greatest things their civilization had produced. That is what the scribal schools of Nippur were doing, at their best. The same thing that we hope our own educational institutions are doing when they are at their best. There are aspects of Sumerian religious life that we know relatively little about because the evidence is ambiguous or because the practices in question were not the kind of thing that got written down for posterity. One of these is the practice of divination, of reading signs in the world to determine what the gods intended and what the future held. I have mentioned the Baru priests, who interpreted astronomical omens for the king, but divination in Sumer extended far beyond astronomy. The examination of animal entrails, particularly the liver of a sacrificed sheep, was one of the most important and elaborate forms of divination. The liver was understood as the seat of the soul in Sumerian belief, and its condition and appearance at the moment of sacrifice were thought to reflect the will of the gods. We have clay models of sheep livers, marked with interpretations of different features and their meanings. These were teaching tools, used to train young diviners in the complex art of reading the liver's messages. The markings on the models are extraordinarily detailed, suggesting that this was a genuine and elaborate discipline, not simply superstition, but a structured body of knowledge with its own internal logic. Dreams were also a source of divine messages, and there was a practice of incubation, sleeping in the temple in the hope of receiving a message from the god in dream form. Gudea of Lagash, the ruler I mentioned earlier who left us those serene statues with their clasped hands, describes receiving instructions from the gods in dreams about how to build his temples. The instructions were detailed and specific enough that he needed a dream interpreter to help him understand them fully. The reading of birds, the interpretation of unusual events, the significance of sounds heard at significant moments, all of these were part of the Sumerian divinatory system. Nothing that happened was purely random. Everything was potentially a message if you knew how to read it. This reflects, again, that anxiety I mentioned earlier, that sense of living in a world where the forces that controlled your fate were not entirely accessible to you, where you had to constantly monitor your environment for signs of divine intention and respond appropriately. But it also reflects something else, an extraordinary attentiveness to the world. If you are trained to read meaning in everything, you see more. You pay attention to what would otherwise pass unnoticed. The Sumerian diviners, in developing their elaborate systems of interpretation, were also developing a habit of observation that contributed to the scientific thinking of later Mesopotamia. The line between divination and observation is not as clear as we might think. The meticulous recording of astronomical events that eventually led to genuine astronomical knowledge began as an attempt to read divine messages in the sky. The careful observation of liver anatomy that might eventually have contributed to medical knowledge began as an attempt to read divine will in the organs of sacrificed animals. The methods were mixed with beliefs we no longer share, but the underlying habit of looking closely, of recording carefully, of comparing observations over time, is the same habit that underlies modern science. The role of the temple in the daily life of ordinary Sumerians extended well beyond the formal rituals of sacrifice and hymn. The temple was a place where you could go with your problems. If you had a dispute with a neighbor that you could not resolve, the temple court could hear it and make a judgment. If you were struggling financially, the temple storehouse might provide emergency rations. If you had a question about whether a particular course of action was wise, or whether the omens were favorable for a journey or a business deal, the temple diviners could help you read the signs. The great festivals of the Sumerian religious calendar brought the entire community together in ways that reinforced social bonds and affirmed the shared identity of the city. The most important festival was the New Year festival, called the Akitu, which involved the god being taken out of the temple and processed through the streets in a great ceremony. The entire city participated. Work stopped. There was music and feasting. The king performed rituals that renewed his divine authorization to rule. These festivals served the same function that great communal celebrations serve in any society. They reminded people that they were part of something larger than themselves, that they shared a story and a set of obligations, and a patron deity who, if properly honored, would continue to protect them. The emotional power of these festivals must have been considerable. Imagine a city of tens of thousands of people, all gathered to watch the god's statue carried through the streets on a great boat, accompanied by music and singing and the smell of incense. The spectacle would have been overwhelming. The sense of collective identity, of being part of this community at this moment, would have been intense. We have descriptions of people weeping during these festivals, moved by the beauty and the solemnity of what they were witnessing. We have descriptions of the crowd pressing close to catch a glimpse of the divine statue, hoping for a moment of particular connection with the god. 5,000 years later, the impulse is familiar. The desire to be part of something larger, the hunger for moments of collective transcendence, the need to affirm, in the company of your community, that you are part of a story that matters. We still feel these things. We find them in different places, but the underlying need has not changed. Let me speak now about the physical experience of living in ancient Sumer, because I want you to feel it, not just understand it intellectually. The smell of the place would be overwhelming to us. Mud and river water and animal dung and cooking fires and the particular sharp smell of sun-baked brick and the sweetness of drying barley spread on rooftops. The smell of fish, because the rivers were full of fish, and fish was a major part of the diet. The smell of bitumen, which was used for waterproofing and which oozed naturally from the ground in certain places and was a significant trade commodity. The sound of the place would be different from anything we know. No engines, no electronic sounds of any kind, but also not silent. The constant sound of the river, the movement of water in the canals, the noise of animals in the streets and the fields, the sound of children, who would have been everywhere, because households were large and children spent most of their time outside. The sound of craftsmen at work, the ring of metal on metal in the smith's workshop, the clack of the loom in the weaving house, the thud of the brickmaker's mold, and at night, different sounds. The city quieted, but did not become silent. The animals were still there. The wind off the river moved through the city. The night watchmen made their rounds, and above everything, on a clear night, the almost inconceivable silence of a sky ablaze with stars. The heat. In summer, the heat of southern Mesopotamia is simply outside the experience of anyone raised in a temperate climate, unless they have lived in one of the hotter desert regions. The temperatures regularly reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun on bare stone or bare earth is almost impossible to touch. You move differently in that heat. You slow down. You seek shade. You time your activities to the morning and the evening, when the heat is merely severe rather than lethal. The Sumerians built their cities with this in mind. The streets were narrow to maximize shade. The houses were built around central courtyards that could trap cooler air. The mud brick itself was an excellent insulator, keeping the interiors cooler than the outside air. The flat roofs, where people slept in summer, were designed to catch the night breeze. They were not primitive in their adaptation to their environment. They were sophisticated. They had figured out, over generations, how to live in this demanding landscape in ways that minimized discomfort and maximized the possibility of getting actual work done. I want to linger now on a specific moment. A moment that I think is one of the most remarkable in the history of human civilization, and one that deserves more attention than it usually receives. It is the moment when the cuneiform script was first used to write not a list of commodities or an account of goods received, but a poem. We cannot know exactly when this happened. The development from purely administrative writing to literary writing was gradual, and the surviving record has gaps. But by around 2500 BCE, the scribes of Sumer were clearly composing and writing down texts that had no administrative purpose whatsoever. Hymns, myths, laments, wisdom sayings, debates between the seasons. Someone looked at this technology that had been invented to count barley and decided to use it for something entirely different. Decided to write a story. That decision, that leap, is the moment when writing became something more than a tool of administration. It became a medium for the expression of human experience. It became literature, and once you have literature, you have something that did not exist before. The ability to share not just facts but feelings, not just information but meaning, not just records but the interior life of human beings across time and space. The first person to write a poem in cuneiform could not have imagined what they were setting in motion. They could not have foreseen that their choice would eventually lead, through thousands of years of development, to every book ever written, every story ever told in written form, every letter ever sent, every word I am speaking to you tonight. It began with someone pressing a wedge into soft clay and making a mark that wasn't for counting anything. That is one of the most beautiful things I know about human history. The long twilight of Sumerian civilization, the centuries between the fall of Ur III and the period when Sumerian as a living language finally ceased to exist, is a period that historical accounts often rush past. But there is something worth pausing on in this twilight, because in those centuries, even as the political power of the Sumerian city-states was extinguished and their language retreated from everyday use, the cultural achievement of Sumer continued to be recognized, honored, and transmitted. The scribal schools of Nippur continued to teach Sumerian. The great myths continued to be copied. The temples of the Sumerian gods continued to receive offerings and maintain their rituals. The kings who ruled the successor states, Babylonian kings, Amorite kings, claimed the legacy of the great Sumerian rulers who had come before them. This recognition, this deliberate choice to claim and carry forward what the Sumerians had built, is itself a remarkable thing. It means that the people who came after understood, at some level, that what Sumer had achieved was worth preserving, that the gods of Sumer were not false gods to be dismissed, but real powers worth honoring, that the stories of Sumer were not primitive tales to be set aside, but profound explorations of human experience worth studying. There is a lesson in this for our own relationship with the past. The Babylonians did not dismiss Sumer because it was old and because its language was difficult and its political power was gone. They engaged with it, learned from it, were shaped by it. They carried it forward. We have largely lost that relationship with Sumer because the break was so complete, because the languages died and the scripts became illegible and the cities became mounds and the tradition was not carried forward in any recognizable form. But in the last century and a half, since the tablets began to be deciphered, we have been building a new relationship with Sumer. We are, in a real sense, doing what the Babylonian scribes did, learning a difficult old language in order to access the thought of a civilization we recognize as foundational, as worth understanding. The work is not complete. It will not be complete for generations. There are still hundreds of thousands of tablets that have not been translated. There are still questions about the Sumerian language and Sumerian culture that we cannot answer. The picture we have is remarkable for what we know, but it is still partial, still shadowy in many of its details. And that is, I think, fitting. Some mystery is appropriate when you are dealing with the first civilization, Some respect for the distance, for the enormity of what we don't know and can't know is appropriate. The Sumerians are not a solved problem. They are an ongoing encounter. As the night moves toward its deepest point, let these final thoughts settle around you like the silt of the ancient rivers. You have been on a long journey tonight, longer than most. You have traveled back to a world before almost everything we take for granted, before steel and concrete and electric light and democracy and the printing press and Christianity and Islam and Buddhism, before Shakespeare and Plato and Confucius, before Rome and Greece and Egypt as we know them. You have been back to the beginning. Not the beginning of everything, but the beginning of this particular thing we call civilization, the experiment in organized, literate, urban human life that has been running now for 6,000 years and shows no sign of ending. The Sumerians started this experiment. They ran it for 3,000 years, and then, slowly, they passed it on. They passed it on to the Babylonians, and the Assyrians, and the Persians, and the Greeks, and the Romans, and the Arabs, and the Europeans, and eventually, through the complicated channels of cultural transmission, to all of us. We are their heirs, not in a direct biological sense, probably, but in the sense that matters more, in the sense that the tools we use, and the ideas we have, and the stories we tell, are built on foundations they laid. When you set an alarm tonight for a particular hour, and the hour is measured in 60 minutes, you are using a Sumerian invention. When you look up at the night sky and see the Pleiades, or Orion, or Scorpius, you are using constellation boundaries that were defined, at least in part, in Mesopotamia. When you read a story that involves a flood and a boat and a man chosen by some divine power to survive and preserve life, you are encountering a Sumerian story. When you feel, reading a law or a contract, that there is something that ought to protect the vulnerable from the powerful, you are experiencing a moral intuition that was first formalized in the clay tablets of ancient Sumer. These things are in you. They have always been in you, in the sense that they have been in the culture that formed you, in the stories you were told, and the ideas you were given, and the ways of organizing the world that you absorbed before you were old enough to question them. The Sumerians are in you, and tonight, having heard something of their story, you know them a little better. That is not a small thing. In a world where so much is forgotten, so much is lost to time and indifference, and the simple accumulation of everything that is new, to take time to remember what was first, to honor the people who started the long experiment we are still running, that is something worth doing. It is, in a small way, the same thing that the Babylonian scribes did when they copied the Sumerian texts into their clay tablets. The same thing that the scholars of the 19th century did when they bent over those tablets by lamplight and worked out what the wedge-shaped marks meant. We are remembering the Sumerians. We are giving them the only kind of immortality that is actually available to the dead. We are thinking of them. The stars are turning above southern Iraq tonight, the same stars the Sumerians watched, though the names we give them have changed, and the stories we tell about them have changed, and the instruments we use to study them would be incomprehensible to the Baru priests who observed them from the tops of their ziggurats. The two rivers are still there. The Tigris and the Euphrates still flow from the mountains of Turkey to the sea, though their courses have shifted and their volumes have diminished, and the world through which they flow is transformed beyond recognition. Somewhere beneath the flat ground, near the modern city of Nasiriyah, what remains of ancient Ur is lying in the dark, the ziggurat still standing above the buried streets, the royal cemetery beneath its meters of undisturbed earth, the tablets in their thousands still waiting in the soil, and in the museums of London and Philadelphia and Baghdad and Istanbul and Chicago and Berlin, the objects that once belonged to the people of Sumer are in their cases, the golden helmet and the lapis lazuli harp and the cylinder seals and the game boards and the tablets covered in cuneiform, all of them waiting for the next person to stand in front of them and look and think and feel the connection that reaches across 5,000 years. You have been on that journey tonight, and now it is time to rest. Let the images go, gently, the flat plain, the great rivers, the ziggurats in the golden light, the scribes in their schools, the priestess in her linen robe, the farmer on his way home, along the canal, Let them drift. Let the sounds of the ancient city quiet, the market winding down, the children called inside, the lamps guttering, the night birds calling from the marshes, at the edge of the world. Let it all settle, like silt, like memory, into the soft dark at the back of your mind where dreams are made. You are warm, you are safe. The night is deep. The Sumerians built the world and then they rested, and the world went on without them. And it is still going, and you are part of it. And that is a remarkable and wonderful thing. Sleep now. The rivers flow to the sea. The stars wheel overhead. And 5,000 years of human civilization holds you gently in the dark. Good night. There is a particular quality to the silence that falls in the last hour before dawn. You may know it if you have ever been awake at that hour, not late, but early, the difference being the direction of the darkness. Late is the tale of one day, early is the beginning of another, and the quality of the quiet is different. Something has shifted in the air, a kind of holding of breath before the light returns. The Sumerians knew that hour. Every human civilization has known it, because sleep and waking follow the sun, and the sun does not change its schedule for anyone. Somewhere in the city of Ur, 4,000 years ago, someone was awake in that hour before dawn, and they were listening to the same kind of silence you might be listening to right now. A guard on the wall, perhaps, watching the darkness and waiting for the first grey line on the horizon. A baker, already at work, because the bread needed to be ready when the city woke. A mother with a sick child, sitting in the lamplight, waiting out the long night. A scribe who had worked late and was still bent over a tablet, finishing one last text before the light failed and the lamp guttered. Or maybe just someone who could not sleep, lying on their roof under the stars, thinking the thoughts that come in the dark hours. We do not know what they thought. We have their records, and their myths and their hymns, but we do not have their private thoughts. The interior life of an individual Sumerian, the texture of an ordinary night, the particular quality of their private fear or their private joy, that is lost. It has always been lost. Even the most detailed historical record cannot give us that, but we can imagine it. We can hold open a space in our minds where that particular person, that guard or baker or mother or scribe, can exist. We can acknowledge that they were real, that their thoughts were real, that their night, whatever it held, mattered to them as completely as your night matters to you. That is not nothing. That is perhaps the most important thing that the study of history can give us. The capacity to hold more lives as real, more people as fully human, more moments as genuinely having occurred and genuinely having mattered. The Sumerians were real, their nights were real, and this night of yours, this particular darkness with its particular quiet and its particular weight of sleep gathering at the edges, is real too. You are here. This moment is happening, and somewhere in the great unbroken chain of human consciousness that stretches back to the banks of the Euphrates and forward to wherever we are going, this night is one more link. Hold that gently. The Sumerians built the first cities so that people would have a safe place to sleep. The walls they built, the laws they wrote, the canals they dug, all of it was in service of this. The possibility of a night where you did not have to be afraid, where the god of the city watched over you, where the walls stood between you and the dark beyond. 6,000 years of human effort, and here you are, benefiting from it, lying in safety in the dark. They would be glad, I think. Whatever part of them is still present, in the soil of Iraq, in the tablets in the museums, in the words of the myths and the hymns, I think they would be glad that what they built is still working, that people can still lie down in safety and close their eyes and drift, that the experiment they started is still going. Let your eyes close now, if they are not already. Let your breathing slow. Let the ancient world hold you. The Tigris and the Euphrates flow to the sea. The ziggurat of Ur rises toward the stars. The scribes are at their desks, pressing the marks of civilization into wet clay, and you are resting, at the end of a very long journey, in the warmth of 6,000 years of human effort and human hope. Sleep. The night is yours, and when the light comes, as it always does, you will wake as your ancestors always woke, reaching back through time to the first people who ever looked at the morning sun and thought, another day, another chance, another gift. Good night. Before silence takes you completely, hold one last image from the ancient world. Picture a clay tablet, small enough to fit in your palm, covered in the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform, pressed there by a hand that has been dust for 5,000 years. The marks are precise. The hand that made them was steady and trained. The person who held that tablet knew what they were doing, had spent years learning to do it, considered it important enough to do carefully. That tablet is somewhere tonight. In a museum storage room perhaps, in an acid-free box on a steel shelf, or in the ground still, waiting to be found, or on a researcher's desk, being photographed and translated by someone who has spent a career learning the language of those marks. The tablet is still here, and the thought it carries, whatever receipt or hymn or myth or letter it contains, that thought is still here too, pressed into clay, waiting for the right reader at the right moment to bring it back to life. That is what writing is. That is what it has always been, since the first mark was pressed into the first wet clay tablet in a city on the banks of the Euphrates 6,000 years ago. An act of faith that someone will read this, an act of trust that the future will be inhabited by beings who care enough to look. You are the answer to that faith. You are the reader the scribes trusted. Good night. The stars are the same stars. The night is the same night. And you, in your particular darkness, are connected to all of it.